Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we're diving into one of the most fascinating and powerful chapters of ancient history. 1,000 miles up the Nile. It is the traveler's lot to dine at many table d'hôtes in the course of many wanderings, but it seldom befalls him to make one of a more miscellaneous gathering than that which overfills the great dining room at Shepherd's Hotel in Cairo during the beginning and height of the regular Egyptian season. Here assemble daily some 200 to 300 persons of all ranks, nationalities, and pursuits, half of whom are Anglo-Indians homeward or outward bound, European residents, or visitors established in Cairo for the winter. The other half, it may be taken for granted, are going up the Nile. So composite and incongruous is this body of Nilegoers, young and old, well-dressed and ill-dressed, learned and unlearned, that the newcomer's first impulse is to inquire from what motives so many persons of dissimilar tastes and training can be led to embark upon an expedition which is, to say the least of it, very tedious, very costly, and of an altogether exceptional interest. His curiosity, however, is soon gratified. Before 2 days are over, he knows everybody's name and everybody's business, distinguishes at first sight between a Cook's tourist and an independent traveler, and has discovered that 9/10 of those whom he is likely to meet up the river are English or American. The rest will be mostly German, with a sprinkling of Belgian and French. So far en bloc, but the details are more heterogeneous still. Here are invalids in search of health, artists in search of subjects, sportsmen keen upon crocodiles, statesmen out for a holiday, special correspondents alert for gossip, collectors on the scent of papyri and mummies, men of science with only scientific ends in view, and the usual surplus of idlers who travel for the mere love of travel or the satisfaction of a purposeless curiosity. Now in a place like Shepherd's, where every fresh arrival has the honor of contributing, for at least a few minutes, to the general entertainment, the first appearance of L, and the writer, tired, dusty, and considerably sunburnt, may well have given rise to some of the comments in usual circulation at those crowded tables. People asked each other, most likely, where these two wandering English women had come from, why they had not dressed for dinner, what brought them to Egypt, and if they also were going up the Nile, to which questions it would have been easy to give satisfactory answers. We came from Alexandria, having had a rough passage from Brindisi followed by 48 hours of quarantine. We had not dressed for dinner because, having driven on from the station in advance of dragoman and luggage, we were but just in time to take seats with the rest. We intended, of course, to go up the Nile, and had any one ventured to inquire in so many words what brought us to Egypt, we should have replied, stress of weather. For in simple truth we had drifted hither by accident, with no excuse of health, or business, or any serious object whatever, and had just taken refuge in Egypt as one might turn aside into the Burlington Arcade or the passage to Panoramas, to get out of the rain. And with good reason. Having left home early in September for a few weeks sketching in central France, we had been pursued by the wettest of wet weather. Washed out of the hill country, we fared no better in the plains. At Nimes, it poured for a month without stopping. Debating at last whether it were better to take our wet umbrellas back at once to England, or push on farther still in search of sunshine, the talk fell upon Algiers, Malta, Cairo, and Cairo carried it. Never was distant expedition entered upon with less premeditation. The thing was no sooner decided than we were gone. Nice, Genoa, Bologna, Ancona flitted by, as in a dream, and Bedreddin Hassan when he awoke at the gates of Damascus was scarcely more surprised than the writer of these pages, when she found herself on board the Simla, and steaming out of the port of Brindisi. Here, then, without definite plans, outfit, or any kind of oriental experience, behold us arrived in Cairo on the 29th of November, 1873, literally, and most prosaically, in search of fine weather. But what had memory to do with rains on land, or storms at sea, or the impatient hours of quarantine, or anything dismal or disagreeable, when one awoke at sunrise to see those gray-green palms outside the window solemnly bowing their plumed heads towards each other, against a rose-colored dawn? It was dark last night, and I had no idea that my room overlooked an enchanted garden, far-reaching and solitary, peopled with stately giants beneath whose tufted crowns hung rich clusters of maroon and amber dates. It was a still, warm morning. Grave gray and black crows flew heavily from tree to tree, or perched, cawing meditatively, upon the topmost branches. Yonder, between the pillared stems, rose the minaret of a very distant mosque, and here where the garden was bounded by a high wall and a windowless house, I saw a veiled lady walking on the terraced roof in the midst of a cloud of pigeons. Nothing could be more simple than the scene and its accessories, nothing, at the same time, more Eastern, strange, and unreal. But in order thoroughly to enjoy an overwhelming, ineffaceable first impression of Oriental out-of-doors life, one should begin in Cairo with a day in the native bazaars, neither buying, nor sketching, nor seeking information, but just taking in scene after scene, with its manifold combinations of light and shade, color, costume, and architectural detail. Every shopfront, every street corner, every turban group is a ready-made picture. The old Turk who sets up his cake stall in the recess of a sculptured doorway, the donkey boy with his gaily caparisoned ass, waiting for customers, the beggar asleep on the steps of the mosque, the veiled woman filling her water jar at the public fountain, they all look as if they had been put there expressly to be painted. Nor is the background less picturesque than the figures. The houses are high and narrow. The upper stories project, and from these again jut windows of delicate turned latticework in old brown wood, like big bird cages. The street is roofed in overhead with long rafters and pieces of matting, through which a dusty sunbeam struggles here and there, casting patches of light upon the moving crowd. The unpaved thoroughfare, a mere narrow lane, full of ruts and watered profusely twice or thrice a day, is lined with little wooden shop fronts, like open cabinets full of shelves, where the merchants sit cross-legged in the midst of their goods, looking out at the passers-by and smoking in silence. Meanwhile, the crowd ebbs and flows unceasingly, a noisy, changing, restless, party-colored tide, half European, half Oriental, on foot, on horseback, and in carriages. Here are Syrian dragomans in baggy trousers and braided jackets, barefooted Egyptian fellahin in ragged blue shirts and felt skullcaps, Greeks in absurdly stiff white tunics, like walking penwipers, Persians with high mitre-like caps of dark woven stuff, swarthy Bedouins in flowing garments, creamy white with chocolate stripes a foot wide, and head shawl of the same bound about the brow with a fillet of twisted camel's hair, Englishmen in palm-leaf hats and knickerbockers, dangling their long legs across almost invisible donkeys, native women of the poorer class, in black veils that leave only the eyes uncovered, and long trailing garments of dark blue and black striped cotton, dervishes in patchwork coats, their matted hair streaming from under fantastic headdresses, blue-black Abyssinians with incredibly slender, bowed legs, like attenuated ebony balustrades, Armenian priests, looking exactly like Portia as the doctor, in long black gowns and high square caps, majestic ghosts of Algerine Arabs, all in white, mounted janissaries with jingling sabers and gold-embroidered jackets, merchants, beggars, soldiers, boatmen, laborers, workmen, in every variety of costume, and of every shade of complexion from fair to dark, from tawny to copper color, from deepest bronze to bluest black. Now a water carrier goes by, bending under the weight of his newly replenished goatskin, the legs of which being tied up, the neck fitted with a brass cock, and the hair left on, looks horribly bloated and lifelike. Now comes a sweetmeat vendor with a tray of that gummy compound known to English children as lumps of delight, and now an Egyptian lady on a large grey donkey led by a servant with a showy saber at his side. The lady wears a rose-colored silk dress and white veil, besides a black silk outer garment, which, being cloak, hood, and veil all in one, fills out with the wind as she rides, like a balloon. She sits astride, her naked feet, in their violet velvet slippers, just resting on the stirrups. She takes care to display a plump brown arm laden with massive gold bracelets, and, to judge by the way in which she uses a pair of liquid black eyes, would not be sorry to let her face be seen also. Nor is the steed less well dressed than his mistress. His close-shaven legs and hindquarters are painted in blue and white zigzags picked out with bands of pale yellow, his high-pommeled saddle is resplendent with velvet and embroidery, and his headgear is all tags, tassels, and fringes. Such a donkey as this is worth from 60 to 100 pounds sterling. Next passes an open barouche full of laughing English women, or a grave provincial sheik all in black, riding a handsome bay Arab, demi-sang, or an Egyptian gentleman in European dress and Turkish fez, driven by an English groom in an English phaeton. Before him, wand in hand, bare-legged, eager-eyed, in Greek skullcap and gorgeous gold-embroidered waistcoat and fluttering white tunic, flies a native sayis, or running footman. No person of position drives in Cairo without one or two of these attendants. The sayis, strong, light, and beautiful, like John of Bologna's Mercury, are said to die young. The pace kills them. Next passes a lemonade seller, with his tin jar in one hand, and his decanter and brass cups in the other, or an itinerant slipper vendor with a bunch of red and yellow Morocco shoes dangling at the end of a long pole, or a London-built miniature brougham containing two ladies in transparent Turkish veils, preceded by a Nubian outrider in semi-military livery, or, perhaps, a train of camels, ill-tempered and supercilious, craning their scrannel necks above the crowd, and laden with canvas bales, scrawled over with Arabic addresses. But the Egyptian, Arab, and Turkish merchants, whether mingling in the general tide or sitting on their counters, are the most picturesque personages in all this busy scene. They wear ample turbans, for the most part white, long vests of striped Syrian silk reaching to the feet, and an outer robe of braided cloth or cashmere. The vest is confined round the waist by a rich sash, and the outer robe, or gibba, is generally of some beautiful degraded color, such as maize, mulberry, olive, peach, sea green, salmon pink, sienna brown, and the like. That these stately beings should vulgarly buy and sell, instead of reposing all their lives on luxurious divans and being waited upon by beautiful Circassians, seems altogether contrary to the eternal fitness of things. Here, for instance, is a grand vizier in a gorgeous white and amber satin vest, who condescends to retail pipe bowls, dull red clay pipe bowls of all sizes and prices. He sells nothing else, and has not only a pile of them on the counter, but a binful at the back of his shop. They are made at Siout in Upper Egypt, and may be bought at the Algerine shops in London almost as cheaply as in Cairo. Another majestic pasha deals in brass and copper vessels, drinking cups, basins, ewers, trays, incense burners, chafing dishes, and the like, some of which are exquisitely engraved with arabesque patterns or sentences from the poets. A third sells silk from the looms of Lebanon, and gold and silver tissues from Damascus. Others, again, sell old arms, old porcelain, old embroideries, second-hand prayer carpets, and quaint little stools and cabinets of ebony inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Here, too, the tobacco merchant sits behind a huge cake of latakia as big as his own body, and the sponge merchant smokes his long chibuk in a bower of sponges. Most amusing of all, however, are those bazaars in which each trade occupies its separate quarter. You pass through an old stone gateway or down a narrow turning, and find yourself amid a colony of saddlers stitching, hammering, punching, riveting. You walk up one alley and down another, between shopfronts hung round with tasseled headgear and humpbacked saddles of all qualities and colors. Here are ladies' saddles, military saddles, donkey saddles, and saddles for great officers of state, saddles covered with red leather, with crimson and violet velvet, with maroon, and gray, and purple cloth, saddles embroidered with gold and silver, studded with brass-headed nails, or trimmed with braid. Another turn or two, and you are in the slipper bazaar, walking down avenues of red and yellow Morocco slippers, the former of home manufacture, the latter from Tunis. Here are slippers with pointed toes, turned-up toes, and toes as round and flat as horseshoes, walking slippers with thick soles, and soft yellow slippers to be worn as inside socks, which have no soles at all. These absurd little scarlet bluchers with tassels are for little boys. The brown Morocco shoes are for grooms, the velvet slippers embroidered with gold and beads and seed pearls are for wealthy harems, and are sold at prices varying from 5 shillings to £5 the pair. The carpet bazaar is of considerable extent, and consists of a network of alleys and counter-alleys opening off to the right of the Musky, which is the Regent Street of Cairo. The houses in most of these alleys are rich in antique lattice windows and Saracenic doorways. One little square is tapestried all round with Persian and Syrian rugs, Damascus saddlebags, and Turkish prayer carpets. The merchants sit and smoke in the midst of their goods, and up in one corner an old kawaji, or coffee seller, plies his humble trade. He has set up his little stove and hanging shelf beside the doorway of a dilapidated khan, the walls of which are faced with arabesque panellings in old carved stone. It is one of the most picturesque bits in Cairo. The striped carpets of Tunis, the dim gray and blue, or gray and red fabrics of Algiers, the shaggy rugs of Laodicea and Smyrna, the rich blues and greens and subdued reds of Turkey, and the wonderfully varied, harmonious patterns of Persia, have each their local habitation in the neighboring alleys. One is never tired of traversing these half-lighted avenues all aglow with gorgeous color and peopled with figures that come and go like the actors in some Christmas piece of Oriental pageantry. In the Khan Khalil, the place of the gold and silver smith's bazaar, there is found, on the contrary, scarcely any display of goods for sale. The alleys are so narrow in this part that 2 persons can with difficulty walk in them abreast, and the shops, tinier than ever, are mere cupboards with about 3 feet of frontage. The back of each cupboard is fitted with tiers of little drawers and pigeonholes, and in front is a kind of matted stone step, called a mastaba, which serves for seat and counter. The customer sits on the edge of the mastaba, the merchant squats, cross-legged, inside. In this position he can, without rising, take out drawer after drawer, and thus the space between the two becomes piled with gold and silver ornaments. These differ from each other only in the metal, the patterns being identical, and they are sold by weight, with a due margin for profit. In dealing with strangers who do not understand the Egyptian system of weights, silver articles are commonly weighed against rupees or 5-franc pieces, and gold articles against Napoleons or sovereigns. The ornaments made in Cairo consist chiefly of chains and earrings, anklets, bangles, necklaces strung with coins or tusk-shaped pendants, amulet cases of filigree or repoussé work, and penannular bracelets of rude execution, but rich and ancient designs. As for the merchants, their civility and patience are inexhaustible. One may turn over their whole stock, try on all their bracelets, go away again and again without buying, and yet be always welcomed and dismissed with smiles. And the writer spent many an hour practicing Arabic in the Khan Khalil, without, it is to be feared, a corresponding degree of benefit to the merchants. There are many other special bazaars in Cairo, as the Sweetmeat Bazaar, the Hardware Bazaar, the Tobacco Bazaar, the Swordmounters and Coppersmiths Bazaars, the Moorish Bazaar, where fez caps, burnouses, and Barbary goods are sold, and some extensive bazaars for the sale of English and French muslins, and Manchester cotton goods, but these last are, for the most part, of inferior interest. Among certain fabrics manufactured in England expressly for the Eastern market, we observed a most hideous printed muslin representing small black devils capering over a yellow ground, and we learned that it was much in favor for children's dresses. But the bazaars, however picturesque, are far from being the only sights of Cairo. There are mosques in plenty, grand old Saracenic gates, ancient Coptic churches, the Museum of Egyptian Antiquities, and, within driving distance, the tombs of the caliphs, Heliopolis, the pyramids, and the Sphinx. To remember in what order the present travelers saw these things would now be impossible, for they lived in a dream, and were at first too bewildered to catalogue their impressions very methodically. Some places they were for the present obliged to dismiss with only a passing glance, others had to be wholly deferred till their return to Cairo. In the meanwhile, our first business was to look at dahabiyas, and the looking at dahabiyas compelled us constantly to turn our steps and our thoughts in the direction of Bulak, a desolate place by the river, where some 200 or 300 Nile boats lay moored for hire. Now, most persons know something of the miseries of house hunting, but only those who have experienced them know how much keener are the miseries of dahabiya hunting. It is more bewildering and more fatiguing, and is beset by its own special and peculiar difficulties. The boats, in the first place, are built on the same plan, which is not the case with houses, and except as they run bigger or smaller, cleaner or dirtier, are as like each other as twin oysters. The same may be said of their captains, with the same differences, for to a person who has been only a few days in Egypt, one black or copper-colored man is exactly like every other black or copper-colored man. Then each reis, or captain, displays the certificates given to him by former travelers, and these certificates, being apparently in active circulation, have a mysterious way of turning up again and again on board different boats and in the hands of different claimants. Nor is this all. Dahabiyas are given to changing their places, which houses do not do, so that the boat which lay yesterday alongside the eastern bank may be over at the western bank today, or hidden in the midst of a dozen others half a mile lower down the river. All this is very perplexing. Yet it is as nothing compared with the state of confusion one gets into when attempting to weigh the advantages or disadvantages of boats with 6 cabins and boats with 8, boats provided with canteen, and boats without, boats that can pass the cataract, and boats that can't, boats that are only twice as dear as they ought to be, and boats with that defect 5 or 6 times multiplied. Their names, again, Ghazal, Sarawak, Fostat, Dongola, unlike any names one has ever heard before, afford as yet no kind of help to the memory. Neither do the names of their captains, for they are all Mohammeds or Hassans. Neither do their prices, for they vary from day to day, according to the state of the market as shown by the returns of arrivals at the principal hotels. Add to all this the fact that no reis speaks anything but Arabic, and that every word of inquiry or negotiation has to be filtered, more or less inaccurately, through a dragoman, and then perhaps those who have not yet tried this variety of the pleasures of the chase may be able to form some notion of the weary, hopeless, puzzling work which lies before the dahabiya hunter in Cairo. Thus it came to pass that, for the first 10 days or so, some 3 or 4 hours had to be devoted every morning to the business of the boats, at the end of which time we were no nearer a conclusion than at first. The small boats were too small for either comfort or safety, especially in what Nile travelers call a big wind. The medium-sized boats, which lie under the suspicion of being used in summer for the transport of cargo, were for the most part of doubtful cleanliness. The largest boats, which alone seemed unexceptionable, contained from 8 to 10 cabins, besides 2 saloons, and were obviously too large for a party consisting of only L, the writer, and a maid. And all were exorbitantly dear. Encompassed by these manifold difficulties, listening now to this and now to that person's opinion, deliberating, haggling, comparing, hesitating, we vibrated daily between Bulak and Cairo, and led a miserable life. Meanwhile, however, we met some former acquaintances, made some new ones, and when not too tired or downhearted, saw what we could of the sights of Cairo, which helped a little to soften the asperities of our lot. One of our first excursions was, of course, to the pyramids, which lie within an hour and a half's easy drive from the hotel door. We started immediately after an early luncheon, followed an excellent road all the way, and were back in time for dinner at 6:30. But it must be understood that we did not go to see the pyramids. We went only to look at them. Later on, having meanwhile been up the Nile and back, and gone through months of training, we came again not only with due leisure, but also with some practical understanding of the manifold phases through which the arts and architecture of Egypt had passed, since those far-off days of Cheops and Chephren. Then, only, we can be said to have seen the pyramids. Until we arrived at that stage of our pilgrimage, it will be well to defer everything like a detailed account of them or their surroundings. Of this first brief visit, enough therefore a brief record. The first glimpse that most travelers now get of the pyramids is from the window of the railway carriage as they come from Alexandria, and it is not impressive. It does not take one's breath away, for instance, like a first sight of the Alps from the high level of the Neuchâtel line, or the outline of the Acropolis at Athens, as one first recognizes it from the sea. The well-known triangular forms look small and shadowy, and are too familiar to be in any way startling. And the same, I think, is true of every distant view of them, that is, of every view which is too distant to afford the means of scaling them against other objects. It is only in approaching them, and observing how they grow with every foot of the road, that one begins to feel they are not so familiar after all. But when at last the edge of the desert is reached, and the long sand slope climbed, and the rocky platform gained, and the Great Pyramid in all its unexpected bulk and majesty towers close above one's head, the effect is as sudden as it is overwhelming. It shuts out the sky and the horizon. It shuts out all the other pyramids. It shuts out everything but the sense of awe and wonder. Now, too, one discovers that it was with the forms of the pyramids, and only their forms, that one had been acquainted all these years past. Of their surface, their color, their relative position, their number, to say nothing of their size, one had hitherto entertained no kind of definite idea. The most careful study of plans and measurements, the clearest photographs, the most elaborate descriptions, had done little or nothing, after all, to make one know the place beforehand. This undulating tableland of sand and rock, pitted with open graves and cumbered with mounds of shapeless masonry, is wholly unlike the desert of our dreams. The pyramids of Cheops and Chephren are bigger than we had expected, the pyramid of Mycerinus is smaller. Here, too, are 9 pyramids, instead of 3. They are all entered in the plans and mentioned in the guidebooks, but, somehow, one is unprepared to find them there, and cannot help looking upon them as intruders. These 6 extra pyramids are small and greatly dilapidated. One, indeed, is little more than a big cairn. Even the Great Pyramid puzzles us with an unexpected sense of unlikeness. We all know, and have known from childhood, that it was stripped of its outer blocks some 500 years ago to build Arab mosques and palaces, but the rugged, rock-like aspect of that giant staircase takes us by surprise, nevertheless. Nor does it look like a partial ruin, either. It looks as if it had been left unfinished, and as if the workmen might be coming back tomorrow morning. The color again is a surprise. Few persons can be aware beforehand of the rich tawny hue that Egyptian limestone assumes after ages of exposure to the blaze of an Egyptian sky. Seen in certain lights, the pyramids look like piles of massy gold. Having but 1 hour and 40 minutes to spend on the spot, we resolutely refused on this first occasion to be shown anything, or told anything, or to be taken anywhere, except, indeed, for a few minutes to the brink of the sand hollow in which the Sphinx lies couchant. We wished to give our whole attention, and all the short time at our disposal, to the Great Pyramid only. To gain some impression of the outer aspect and size of this enormous structure, to steady our minds to something like an understanding of its age, was enough, and more than enough, for so brief a visit. For it is no easy task to realize, however imperfectly, the duration of 6,000 or 7,000 years, and the Great Pyramid, which is supposed to have been some 4,200 and odd years old at the time of the birth of Christ, is now in its 7th millenary. Standing there close against the base of it, touching it, measuring her own height against one of its lowest blocks, looking up all the stages of that vast, receding, rugged wall, which leads upward like an alpine buttress and seems almost to touch the sky, the writer suddenly became aware that these remote dates had never presented themselves to her mind until this moment as anything but abstract numerals. Now, for the first time, they resolved themselves into something concrete, definite, real. They were no longer figures, but years with their changes of season, their high and low Niles, their seed times and harvests. The consciousness of that moment will never, perhaps, quite wear away. It was as if one had been snatched up for an instant to some vast height overlooking the plains of time, and had seen the centuries mapped out beneath one's feet. To appreciate the size of the Great Pyramid is less difficult than to apprehend its age. No one who has walked the length of one side, climbed to the top, and learned the dimensions from Murray, can fail to form a tolerably clear idea of its mere bulk. The measurements given by Sir Gardner Wilkinson are as follows: length of each side, 732 feet, perpendicular height, 480 feet 9 inches, area 535,824 square feet. 1 That is to say, it stands 115 feet 9 inches higher than the cross on the top of St. Paul's, and about 20 feet lower than Box Hill in Surrey, and if transported bodily to London, it would a little more than cover the whole area of Lincoln's Inn Fields. These are sufficiently matter-of-fact statements, and sufficiently intelligible, but, like most calculations of the kind, they diminish rather than do justice to the dignity of the subject. More impressive by far than the weightiest array of figures of the most striking comparisons, was the shadow cast by the Great Pyramid as the sun went down. That mighty shadow, sharp and distinct, stretched across the stony platform of the desert and over full 3/4 of a mile of the green plain below. It divided the sunlight where it fell, just as its great original divided the sunlight in the upper air, and it darkened the space it covered, like an eclipse. It was not without a thrill of something approaching to awe that one remembered how this selfsame shadow had gone on registering, not only the height of the most stupendous gnomon ever set up by human hands, but the slow passage, day by day, of more than 60 centuries of the world's history. It was still lengthening over the landscape as we went down the long sand slope and regained the carriage. Some 6 or 8 Arabs in fluttering white garments ran on ahead to bid us a last goodbye. That we should have driven over from Cairo only to sit quietly down and look at the Great Pyramid had filled them with unfeigned astonishment. With such energy and dispatch as the modern traveler uses, we might have been to the top, and seen the temple of the Sphinx, and done 2 or 3 of the principal tombs in the time. "You come again," said they. "Good Arab show you everything. You see nothing this time." So, promising to return ere long, we drove away, well content, nevertheless, with the way in which our time had been spent. The Pyramid Bedouins have been plentifully abused by travelers and guidebooks, but we found no reason to complain of them now or afterwards. They neither crowded round us, nor followed us, nor importuned us in any way. They are naturally vivacious and very talkative, yet the gentle fellows were dumb as mutes when they found we wished for silence. And they were satisfied with a very moderate bakshish at parting. As a fitting sequel to this excursion, we went, I think next day, to see the Mosque of Sultan Hassan, which is one of those medieval structures said to have been built with the casing stones of the Great Pyramid. The Mosque of Sultan Hassan, confessedly the most beautiful in Cairo, is also perhaps the most beautiful in the Moslem world. It was built at just that happy moment when Arabian art in Egypt, having ceased merely to appropriate or imitate, had at length evolved an original architectural style out of the heterogeneous elements of Roman and early Christian edifices. The mosques of a few centuries earlier, as, for instance, that of Tuluan, which marks the first departure from the old Byzantine model, consisted of little more than a courtyard with colonnades leading to a hall supported on a forest of pillars. A little more than a century later, and the national style had already experienced the beginnings of that prolonged eclipse which finally resulted in the bastard Neo-Byzantine Renaissance represented by the Mosque of Mehemet Ali. But the Mosque of Sultan Hassan, built 97 years before the taking of Constantinople, may justly be regarded as the highest point reached by Saracenic art in Egypt after it had used up the Greek and Roman material of Memphis, and before its newborn originality became modified by influences from beyond the Bosphorus. Its preeminence is due neither to the greatness of its dimensions nor to the splendor of its materials. It is neither so large as the great mosque at Damascus, nor so rich in costly marbles as St. Sophia in Constantinople, but in design, proportion, and a certain lofty grace impossible to describe, it surpasses these, and every other mosque, whether original or adapted, with which the writer is acquainted. The whole structure is purely national. Every line and curve in it, and every inch of detail, is in the best style of the best period of the Arabian school. And above all, it was designed expressly for its present purpose. The 2 famous mosques of Damascus and Constantinople having, on the contrary, been Christian churches, betray evidences of adaptation. In St. Sophia, the space once occupied by the figure of the Redeemer may be distinctly traced in the mosaic work of the apse, filled in with gold tesserae of later date, while the magnificent gates of the great mosque at Damascus are decorated, among other Christian emblems, with the sacramental chalice. But the Mosque of Sultan Hassan, built by Nasir Hassan in the high and palmy days of the Mamluk rule, is marred by no discrepancies. For a mosque it was designed, and a mosque it remains. Too soon it will be only a beautiful ruin. A number of small streets having lately been demolished in this quarter, the approach to the mosque lies across a desolate open space littered with debris, but destined to be laid out as a public square. With this desirable end in view, some half-dozen workmen were lazily loading as many camels with rubble, which is the Arab way of carting rubbish. If they persevere, and the Minister of Public Works continues to pay their wages with due punctuality, the ground will perhaps get cleared in 8 or 10 years' time. Driving up with some difficulty to the foot of the great steps, which were crowded with idlers smoking and sleeping, we observed a long and apparently fast-widening fissure reaching nearly from top to bottom of the main wall of the building, close against the minaret. It looked like just such a rent as might be caused by a shock of earthquake, and, being still new to the East, we wondered the government had not set to work to mend it. We had yet to learn that nothing is ever mended in Cairo. Here, as in Constantinople, new buildings spring up apace, but the old, no matter how venerable, are allowed to molder away, inch by inch, till nothing remains but a heap of ruins. Going up the steps and through a lofty hall, up some more steps and along a gloomy corridor, we came to the great court, before entering which, however, we had to take off our boots and put on slippers brought for the purpose. The first sight of this court is an architectural surprise. It is like nothing one has seen before, and its beauty equals its novelty. Imagine an immense marble quadrangle, open to the sky and enclosed within lofty walls, with, at each side, a vast recess framed in by a single arch. The quadrangle is more than 100 feet square, and the walls are more than 100 feet high. Each recess forms a spacious hall for rest and prayer, and all are matted, but that at the eastern end is wider and considerably deeper than the other three, and the noble arch that encloses it like the proscenium of a splendid stage, measures, according to Ferguson, 69 feet 5 inches in the span. It looks much larger. This principal hall, the floor of which is raised one step at the upper end, measures 90 feet in depth and 90 in height. The dais is covered with prayer rugs, and contains the holy niche and the pulpit of the preacher. We observed that those who came up here came only to pray. Having prayed, they either went away or turned aside into one of the other recesses to rest. There was a charming fountain in the court, with a dome roof as light and fragile-looking as a big bubble, at which each worshipper performed his ablutions on coming in. This done, he left his slippers on the matting and trod the carpeted dais barefoot. This was the first time we had seen Moslems at prayer, and we could not but be impressed by their profound and unaffected devotion. Some lay prostrate, their foreheads touching the ground, others were kneeling, others bowing in the prescribed attitudes of prayer. So absorbed were they, that not even our unhallowed presence seemed to disturb them. We did not then know that the pious Moslem is as devout out of the mosque as in it, or that it is his habit to pray when the appointed hours come round, no matter where he may be, or how occupied. We soon became so familiar, however, with this obvious trait of Mohammedan life, that it seemed quite a matter of course that the camel driver should dismount and lay his forehead in the dust by the roadside, or the merchant spread his prayer carpet on the narrow mastaba of his little shop in the public bazaar, or the boatman prostrate himself with his face to the east, as the sun went down behind the hills of the Libyan desert. While we were admiring the spring of the roof and the intricate arabesque decorations of the pulpit, a custode came up with a big key and invited us to visit the tomb of the founder. So we followed him into an enormous vaulted hall 100 feet square, in the center of which stood a plain, railed-off tomb, with an empty iron-bound coffer at the foot. We afterwards learned that for 500 years, that is to say, ever since the death and burial of Sultan Hassan, this coffer had contained a fine copy of the Quran, traditionally said to have been written by Sultan Hassan's own hand, but that the Khedive, who is collecting choice and antique Arabic mizas, had only the other day sent an order for its removal. Nothing can be bolder or more elegant than the proportions of this noble sepulchral hall, the walls of which are covered with tracery in low relief encrusted with discs and tesserae of turquoise-colored porcelain, while high up, in order to lead off the vaulting of the roof, the corners are rounded by means of recessed clusters of exquisite arabesque woodwork, like pendant stalactites. But the tesserae are fast falling out, and most of their places are vacant, and the beautiful woodwork hangs in fragments, tattered and cobwebbed, like time-worn banners which the first touch of a brush would bring down. Going back again from the tomb to the courtyard, we everywhere observed traces of the same dilapidation. The fountain, once a miracle of Saracenic ornament, was fast going to destruction. The rich marbles of its basement were cracked and discolored, its stuccoed cupola was flaking off piecemeal, its enamels were dropping out, its lace-like wood tracery shredding away by inches. Presently a tiny brown and golden bird perched with pretty confidence on the brink of the basin, and having splashed, and drunk, and preened its feathers like a true believer at his ablutions, flew up to the top of the cupola and sang deliciously. All else was profoundly still. Large spaces of light and shadow divided the quadrangle. The sky showed overhead as a square opening of burning solid blue, while here and there, reclining, praying, or quietly occupied, a number of turbaned figures were picturesquely scattered over the matted floors of the open halls around. Yonder sat a tailor cross-legged, making a waistcoat. Near him, stretched on his face at full length, sprawled a basket-maker with his half-woven basket and bundle of rushes beside him, and here, close against the main entrance, lay a blind man and his dog, the master asleep, the dog keeping watch. It was, as I have said, our first mosque, and I well remember the surprise with which I saw that tailor sewing on his buttons, and the sleepers lying about in the shade. We did not then know that a Mohammedan mosque is as much a place of rest and refuge as of prayer, or that the houseless Arab may take shelter there by night or day as freely as the birds may build their nests in the cornice, or the blind man's dog may share the cool shade with his sleeping master. From the mosque of this Memluk sovereign it is but a few minutes uphill drive to the mosque of Mehemet Ali, by whose orders the last of that royal race were massacred just 64 years ago. 1 This mosque, built within the precincts of the citadel on a spur of the Mokattam hills overlooking the city, is the most conspicuous object in Cairo. Its attenuated minarets and clustered domes show from every point of view for miles around, and remain longer in sight, as one leaves, or returns to, Cairo, than any other landmark. It is a spacious, costly, gaudy, commonplace building, with nothing really beautiful about it, except the great marble courtyard and fountain. The inside, which is entirely built of oriental alabaster, is carpeted with magnificent Turkey carpets and hung with innumerable cut-glass chandeliers, so that it looks like a huge vulgar drawing room from which the furniture has been cleared out for dancing. The view from the outer platform is, however, magnificent. We saw it on a hazy day, and could not therefore distinguish the point of the delta, which ought to have been visible on the north, but we could plainly see as far southward as the pyramids of Saqqara, and trace the windings of the Nile for many miles across the plain. The pyramids of Gizeh, on their dais of desert rock about 12 miles off, looked, as they always do look from a distance, small and unimpressive, but the great alluvial valley dotted over with mud villages and intersected by canals and tracts of palm forest, the shining river specked with sails, and the wonderful city, all flat roofs, cupolas, and minarets, spread out like an intricate model at one's feet, were full of interest and absorbed our whole attention. Looking down upon it from this elevation, it is as easy to believe that Cairo contains 400 mosques, as it is to stand on the brow of the Pincio and believe in the 365 churches of modern Rome. As we came away, they showed us the place in which the Memluk nobles, 472 in number, were shot down like mad dogs in a trap, that fatal 1st of March AD 1811. We saw the upper gate which was shut behind them as they came out from the presence of the Pasha, and the lower gate which was shut before them to prevent their egress. The walls of the narrow roadway in which the slaughter was done are said to be pitted with bullet marks, but we would not look for them. I have already said that I do not very distinctly remember the order of our sightseeing in Cairo, for the reason that we saw some places before we went up the river, some after we came back, and some, as for instance the museum at Bulak, both before and after, and indeed as often as possible. But I am at least quite certain that we witnessed a performance of howling dervishes, and the departure of the caravan for Mecca, before starting. Of all the things that people do by way of pleasure, the pursuit of a procession is surely one of the most wearisome. They generally go a long way to see it, they wait a weary time, it is always late, and when at length it does come, it is over in a few minutes. The present pageant fulfilled all these conditions in a superlative degree. We breakfasted uncomfortably early, started soon after 7:30, and had taken up our position outside the Bab and Nasser, on the way to the desert, by 8:30. Here we sat for nearly 3 hours, exposed to clouds of dust and a burning sun, with nothing to do but to watch the crowd and wait patiently. All Shepheard's Hotel was there, and every stranger in Cairo, and we all had smart open carriages drawn by miserable screws and driven by bare-legged Arabs. These Arabs, by the way, are excellent whips, and the screws get along wonderfully, but it seems odd at first, and not a little humiliating, to be whirled along behind a coachman whose only livery consists of a rag of dirty white turban, a scant tunic just reaching to his knees, and the top boots with which nature has provided him. Here, outside the walls, the crowd increased momentarily. The place was like a fair with provision stalls, swings, storytellers, serpent charmers, cake sellers, sweetmeat sellers, sellers of sherbet, water, lemonade, sugared nuts, fresh dates, hard-boiled eggs, oranges, and sliced watermelon. Veiled women carrying little bronze cupids of children astride upon the right shoulder, swarthy Egyptians, coal-black Abyssinians, Arabs and Nubians of every shade from golden brown to chocolate, fellahs, dervishes, donkey boys, street urchins, and beggars with every imaginable deformity, came and went, squeezed themselves in and out among the carriages, lined the road on each side of the great towered gateway, swarmed on the top of every wall, and filled the air with laughter, a babble of dialects, and those odors of Araby that are inseparable from an Eastern crowd. A harmless, unsavory, good-humored, inoffensive throng, one glance at which was enough to put to flight all one's preconceived notions about Oriental gravity of demeanor. For the truth is that gravity is by no means an Oriental characteristic. Take a Mohammedan at his devotions, and he is a model of religious abstraction, bargain with him for a carpet, and he is as impenetrable as a judge, but see him in his hours of relaxation, or on the occasion of a public holiday, and he is as garrulous and full of laughter as a big child. Like a child, too, he loves noise and movement for the mere sake of noise and movement, and looks upon swings and fireworks as the height of human felicity. Now swings and fireworks are Arabic for bread and circuses, and our plebs' passion for them is insatiable. He not only indulges in them upon every occasion of public rejoicing, but calls in their aid to celebrate the most solemn festivals of his religion. It so happened that we afterwards came in the way of several Mohammedan festivals both in Egypt and Syria, and we invariably found the swings at work all day and the fireworks going off every evening. Today, the swings outside the Bab and Nasser were never idle. Here were creaking Russian swings hung with little painted chariots for the children, and plain rope swings, some of them as high as Haman's gallows, for the men. For my own part, I know no sight much more comic and incongruous than the serene enjoyment with which a bearded, turbaned, middle-aged Egyptian squats upon his heels on the tiny wooden seat of one of these enormous swings, and, holding on to the side ropes for dear life, goes careering up 40 feet high into the air at every turn. At a little before midday, when the heat and glare were becoming intolerable, the swings suddenly ceased going, the crowd surged in the direction of the gate, and a distant drumming announced the approach of the procession. First came a string of baggage camels laden with tent furniture, then some 200 pilgrims on foot, chanting passages from the Quran, then a regiment of Egyptian infantry, the men in a coarse white linen uniform consisting of coat, baggy trousers and gaiters, with crossbelts and cartouche boxes of plain black leather, and the red fez, or tarbush, on the head. Next after these came more pilgrims, followed by a body of dervishes carrying green banners embroidered with Arabic sentences in white and yellow, then a native cavalry regiment headed by a general and 4 colonels in magnificent gold embroidery and preceded by an excellent military band, then another band and a second regiment of infantry, then more colonels, followed by a regiment of lancers mounted on capital grey horses and carrying lances topped with small red and green pennants. After these had gone by there was a long stoppage, and then, with endless breaks and interruptions, came a straggling irregular crowd of pilgrims, chiefly of the fellah class, beating small darabuks, or native drums. Those about us estimated their number at 2,000. And now, their guttural chorus audible long before they arrived in sight, came the howling dervishes, a ragged, wild-looking, ruffianly set, rolling their heads from side to side, and keeping up a hoarse incessant cry of Allah, Allah, Allah. Of these there may have been a couple of hundred. The sheiks of the principal orders of dervishes came next in order, superbly dressed in robes of brilliant colors embroidered with gold, and mounted on magnificent Arabs. Finest of all, in a green turban and scarlet mantle, rode the sheik of the Hazanin, who is a descendant of the Prophet, but the most important, the Sheikh el-Bikri, who is a sort of Egyptian Archbishop of Canterbury and head of all the dervishes, came last, riding a white Arab with gold-embroidered housings. He was a placid-looking old man, and wore a violet robe and an enormous red and green turban. This very reverend personage was closely followed by the chief of the Carpetmakers' Guild, a handsome man sitting sidewise on a camel. Then happened another break in the procession, an eager pause, a gathering murmur. And then, riding a gaunt dromedary at a rapid trot, his fat sides shaking, and his head rolling in a stupid drunken way at every step, appeared a bloated, half-naked Silenus, with long fuzzy black locks and a triple chin, and no other clothing than a pair of short white drawers and red slippers. A shiver of delight ran through the crowd at sight of this holy man, the famous Sheik of the Camel, Sheik el-Jemel, the great, good priest, the idol of the people. We afterwards learned that this was his 20th pilgrimage, and that he was supposed to fast, roll his head, and wear nothing but this pair of loose drawers, all the way to and from Mecca. But the crowning excitement was yet to come, and the rapture with which the crowd had greeted the Sheik el-Jemel was as nothing compared with their ecstasy when the Mammal, preceded by another group of mounted officers and borne by a gigantic camel, was seen coming through the gateway. The women held up their children, the men swarmed up the scaffoldings of the swings and behind the carriages. They screamed, they shouted, they waved handkerchiefs and turbans, they were beside themselves with excitement. Meanwhile the camel, as if conscious of the dignity of his position and the splendor of his trappings, came on slowly and ponderously with his nose in the air, and passed close before our horses' heads. We could not possibly have had a better view of the Mammal, which is nothing but a sort of cage, or pagoda, of gilded tracery very richly decorated. In the days of the Memluks, the Mammal represented the litter of the Sultan, and went empty, like a royal carriage at a public funeral. But we were told that it now carried the tribute carpet sent annually by the carpet-makers of Cairo to the tomb of the Prophet. This closed the procession. As the camel passed, the crowd surged in, and everything like order was at an end. The carriages all made at once for the gate, so meeting the full tide of the outpouring crowd and causing unimaginable confusion. Some stuck in the sand halfway, our own among the number, and all got into an inextricable block in the narrow part just inside the gate. Hereupon the drivers abused each other, and the crowd got impatient, and some Europeans got pelted. Coming back, we met 2 or 3 more regiments. The men, both horse and foot, seemed fair average specimens, and creditably disciplined. They rode better than they marched, which was to be expected. The uniform is the same for cavalry and infantry throughout the service, the only difference being that the former wear short black riding boots, and the latter, gaiters of white linen. They are officered up to a certain point by Egyptians, but the commanding officers and the staff, among whom are enough colonels and generals to form an ordinary regiment, are chiefly Europeans and Americans. It had seemed, while the procession was passing, that the proportion of pilgrims was absurdly small when compared with the display of military, but this, which is called the departure of the caravan, is in truth only the procession of the sacred carpet from Cairo to the camp outside the walls, and the troops are present merely as part of the pageant. The true departure takes place 2 days later. The pilgrims then muster in great numbers, but the soldiery is reduced to a small escort. It was said that 7,000 souls went out this year from Cairo and its neighborhood. Today, the swings outside the Bab and Nasser were never idle. Here were creaking Russian swings hung with little painted chariots for the children, and plain rope swings, some of them as high as Haman's gallows, for the men. For my own part, I know no sight much more comic and incongruous than the serene enjoyment with which a bearded, turbaned, middle-aged Egyptian squats upon his heels on the tiny wooden seat of one of these enormous swings, and, holding on to the side ropes for dear life, goes careering up 40 feet high into the air at every turn. At a little before midday, when the heat and glare were becoming intolerable, the swings suddenly ceased going, the crowd surged in the direction of the gate, and a distant drumming announced the approach of the procession. First came a string of baggage camels laden with tent furniture, then some 200 pilgrims on foot, chanting passages from the Quran, then a regiment of Egyptian infantry, the men in a coarse white linen uniform consisting of coat, baggy trousers and gaiters, with crossbelts and cartouche boxes of plain black leather, and the red fez, or tarbush, on the head. Next after these came more pilgrims, followed by a body of dervishes carrying green banners embroidered with Arabic sentences in white and yellow, then a native cavalry regiment headed by a general and 4 colonels in magnificent gold embroidery and preceded by an excellent military band, then another band and a 2nd regiment of infantry, then more colonels, followed by a regiment of lancers mounted on capital grey horses and carrying lances topped with small red and green pennants. After these had gone by there was a long stoppage, and then, with endless breaks and interruptions, came a straggling irregular crowd of pilgrims, chiefly of the fellah class, beating small darabuks, or native drums. Those about us estimated their number at 2,000. And now, their guttural chorus audible long before they arrived in sight, came the howling dervishes, a ragged, wild-looking, ruffianly set, rolling their heads from side to side, and keeping up a hoarse incessant cry of Allah, Allah, Allah. Of these there may have been a couple of hundred. The sheiks of the principal orders of dervishes came next in order, superbly dressed in robes of brilliant colors embroidered with gold, and mounted on magnificent Arabs. Finest of all, in a green turban and scarlet mantle, rode the sheik of the Hazanin, who is a descendant of the Prophet, but the most important, the Sheikh el-Bikri, who is a sort of Egyptian Archbishop of Canterbury and head of all the dervishes, came last, riding a white Arab with gold-embroidered housings. He was a placid-looking old man, and wore a violet robe and an enormous red and green turban. This very reverend personage was closely followed by the chief of the Carpetmakers' Guild, a handsome man sitting sidewise on a camel. Then happened another break in the procession, an eager pause, a gathering murmur. And then, riding a gaunt dromedary at a rapid trot, his fat sides shaking, and his head rolling in a stupid drunken way at every step, appeared a bloated, half-naked Silenus, with long fuzzy black locks and a triple chin, and no other clothing than a pair of short white drawers and red slippers. A shiver of delight ran through the crowd at sight of this holy man, the famous Sheik of the Camel, Sheik el-Jemel, the great, good priest, the idol of the people. We afterwards learned that this was his 20th pilgrimage, and that he was supposed to fast, roll his head, and wear nothing but this pair of loose drawers, all the way to and from Mecca. But the crowning excitement was yet to come, and the rapture with which the crowd had greeted the Sheik el-Jemel was as nothing compared with their ecstasy when the Mammal, preceded by another group of mounted officers and borne by a gigantic camel, was seen coming through the gateway. The women held up their children, the men swarmed up the scaffoldings of the swings and behind the carriages. They screamed, they shouted, they waved handkerchiefs and turbans, they were beside themselves with excitement. Meanwhile the camel, as if conscious of the dignity of his position and the splendor of his trappings, came on slowly and ponderously with his nose in the air, and passed close before our horses' heads. We could not possibly have had a better view of the mammal, which is nothing but a sort of cage, or pagoda, of gilded tracery very richly decorated. In the days of the Memluks, the mammal represented the litter of the Sultan, and went empty, like a royal carriage at a public funeral. But we were told that it now carried the tribute carpet sent annually by the carpet-makers of Cairo to the tomb of the Prophet. This closed the procession. As the camel passed, the crowd surged in, and everything like order was at an end. The carriages all made at once for the gate, so meeting the full tide of the outpouring crowd and causing unimaginable confusion. Some stuck in the sand halfway, our own among the number, and all got into an inextricable block in the narrow part just inside the gate. Hereupon the drivers abused each other, and the crowd got impatient, and some Europeans got pelted. Coming back, we met 2 or 3 more regiments. The men, both horse and foot, seemed fair average specimens, and creditably disciplined. They rode better than they marched, which was to be expected. The uniform is the same for cavalry and infantry throughout the service, the only difference being that the former wear short black riding boots, and the latter, gaiters of white linen. They are officered up to a certain point by Egyptians, but the commanding officers and the staff, among whom are enough colonels and generals to form an ordinary regiment, are chiefly Europeans and Americans. It had seemed, while the procession was passing, that the proportion of pilgrims was absurdly small when compared with the display of military, but this, which is called the departure of the caravan, is in truth only the procession of the sacred carpet from Cairo to the camp outside the walls, and the troops are present merely as part of the pageant. The true departure takes place 2 days later. The pilgrims then muster in great numbers, but the soldiery is reduced to a small escort. It was said that 7,000 souls went out this year from Cairo and its neighborhood. The procession took place on Thursday, the 21st day of the Mohammedan month of Shawwal, which was our 11th of December. The next day, Friday, being the Mohammedan Sabbath, we went to the convent of the Howling Dervishes, which lies beyond the walls in a quiet nook between the riverside and the part known as Old Cairo. We arrived a little after 2, and passing through a courtyard shaded by a great sycamore, were ushered into a large, square, whitewashed hall with a dome roof and a neatly matted floor. The place in its arrangements resembled none of the mosques that we had yet seen. There was, indeed, nothing to arrange, no pulpit, no holy niche, no lamps, no prayer carpets, nothing but a row of cane-bottomed chairs at one end, some of which were already occupied by certain of our fellow guests at Shefford's Hotel. A party of some 40 or 50 wild-looking dervishes were squatting in a circle at the opposite side of the hall, their outer kaftans and queer pyramidal hats lying in a heap close by. Being accommodated with chairs among the other spectators, we waited for whatever might happen. More dervishes and more English dropped in from time to time. The new dervishes took off their caps and sat down among the rest, laughing and talking together at their ease. The English sat in a row, shy, uncomfortable, and silent, wondering whether they ought to behave as if they were in church, and mortally ashamed of their feet. For we had all been obliged to take off or cover our boots before going in, and those who had forgotten to bring slippers had their feet tied up in pocket handkerchiefs. A long time went by thus. At last, when the number of dervishes had increased to about 70, and every one was tired of waiting, 8 musicians came in, 2 trumpets, 2 lutes, a coconut fiddle, a tambourine, and 2 drums. Then the dervishes, some of whom were old and white-haired and some mere boys, formed themselves into a great circle, shoulder to shoulder. The band struck up a plaintive, discordant air, and a grave middle-aged man, placing himself in the center of the ring, and inclining his head at each repetition, began to recite the name of Allah. Softly at first, and one by one, the dervishes took up the chant, Allah, Allah, Allah. Their heads and their voices rose and fell in unison. The dome above gave back a hollow echo. There was something strange and solemn in the ceremony. Presently, however, the trumpets brayed louder, the voices grew hoarser, the heads bowed lower, the name of Allah rang out faster and faster, fiercer and fiercer. The leader, himself cool and collected, began sensibly accelerating the time of the chorus, and it became evident that the performers were possessed by a growing frenzy. Soon the whole circle was madly rocking to and fro, the voices rose to a hoarse scream, and only the trumpets were audible above the din. Now and then a dervish would spring up convulsively some 3 or 4 feet above the heads of the others, but for the most part they stood rooted firmly to one spot, now bowing their heads almost to their feet, now flinging themselves so violently back, that we, standing behind, could see their faces foreshortened upside down, and this with such incredible rapidity, that their long hair had scarcely time either to rise or fall, but remained as if suspended in mid-air. Still the frenzy mounted, still the pace quickened. Some shrieked, some groaned, some, unable to support themselves any longer, were held up in their places by the bystanders. All were mad for the time being. Our own head seemed to be going round at last, and more than one of the ladies present looked longingly towards the door. It was, in truth, a horrible sight, and needed only darkness and torchlight to be quite diabolical. At length, just as the fury was at its height and the very building seemed to be rocking to and fro above our heads, one poor wretch staggered out of the circle and fell writhing and shrieking close against our feet. At the same moment, the leader clapped his hands, the performers, panting and exhausted, dropped into a sitting posture, and the first zikr, as it is called, came abruptly to an end. Some few, however, could not stop immediately, but kept on swaying and muttering to themselves, while the one in the fit, having ceased to shriek, lay out stiff and straight, apparently in a state of coma. There was a murmur of relief and a simultaneous rising among the spectators. It was announced that another zikr, with a reinforcement of fresh dervishes, would soon begin, but the Europeans had had enough of it, and few remained for the second performance. Going out, we paused beside the poor fellow on the floor, and asked if nothing could be done for him. "He is struck by Muhammad," said gravely an Egyptian official who was standing by. At that moment, the leader came over, knelt down beside him, touched him lightly on the head and breast, and whispered something in his ear. The man was then quite rigid, and white as death. We waited, however, and after a few more minutes saw him struggle back into a dazed, half-conscious state, when he was helped to his feet and led away by his friends. The courtyard as we came out was full of dervishes sitting on cane benches in the shade, and sipping coffee. The green leaves rustled overhead, with glimpses of intensely blue sky between, and brilliant patches of sunshine flickered down upon groups of wild-looking, half-savage figures in party-colored garments. It was one of those ready-made subjects that the sketcher passes by with a sigh, but which live in his memory forever. From hence, being within a few minutes' drive of Old Cairo, we went on as far as the Mosque of Amr, an uninteresting ruin standing alone among the rubbish mounds of the first Mohammedan capital of Egypt. It is constructed on the plan of a single quadrangle 225 feet square, surrounded by a covered colonnade, one range of pillars in depth on the west, which is the side of the entrance, 4 on the north, 3 on the south, and 6 on the east, which is the place of prayer, and contains 3 holy niches and the pulpit. The columns, 245 in number, have been brought from earlier Roman and Byzantine buildings. They are of various marbles and have all kinds of capitals. Some, being originally too short, have been stilted on disproportionately high bases, and in one instance the necessary height has been obtained by adding a second capital on the top of the first. We observed one column of that rare black and white speckled marble of which there is a specimen in the pulpit of St. Mark's in Venice, and one of the holy niches contains some fragments of Byzantine mosaics. But the whole building seems to have been put together in a barbarous way, and would appear to owe its present state of dilapidation more to bad workmanship than to time. Many of the pillars, especially on the western side, are fallen and broken. The octagonal fountain in the center is a roofless ruin, and the little minaret at the S.E. corner is no longer safe. Apart, however, from its poverty of design and detail, the Mosque of Amr is interesting as a point of departure in the history of Saracenic architecture. It was built by Amr ibn el-Az, the Arab conqueror of Egypt, in the 21st year of the Hijra, AD 642, just 10 years after the death of Muhammad, and it is the earliest Saracenic edifice in Egypt. We were glad, therefore, to have seen it for this reason, if for no other. But it is a barren, dreary place, and the glare reflected from all sides of the quadrangle was so intense that we were thankful to get away again into the narrow streets beside the river. Here we presently fell in with a wedding procession consisting of a crowd of men, a band, and some 3 or 4 hired carriages full of veiled women, one of whom was pointed out as the bride. The bridegroom walked in the midst of the men, who seemed to be teasing him, drumming round him, and opposing his progress, while high above the laughter, the shouting, the jingle of tambourines and the thrumming of darabucks, was heard the shrill squeal of some instrument that sounded exactly like a bagpipe. It was a brilliant afternoon, and we ended our day's work, I remember, with a drive on the Shubra Road and a glance at the gardens of the Khedive's summer palace. The Shubra Road is the Champs-Élysées of Cairo, and is thronged every day from 4 to 6:30. Here little sheds of roadside cafes alternate with smart modern villas, ragged fellahin on jaded donkeys trot side by side with elegant attaches on high-stepping Arabs, while tourists in hired carriages, Jew bankers in unexceptionable phaetons, veiled harems in London-built broughams, Italian shopkeepers in preposterously fashionable toilettes, grave sheiks on magnificent Cairo asses, officers in frogged and braided frocks, and English girls in tall hats and close-fitting habits, followed by the inevitable little solemn-looking English groom, pass and repass, precede and follow each other, in one changing, restless, heterogeneous stream, the like of which is to be seen in no other capital in the world. The sons of the Khedive drive here daily, always in separate carriages and preceded by 4 sayyises and 4 guards. They are of all ages and sizes, from the hereditary prince, a pale, gentlemanly-looking young man of 4 or 5 and 20, down to one tiny, imperious atom of about 6, who is dressed like a little man, and is constantly leaning out of his carriage window and shrilly abusing his coachman. Apart, however, from those who frequent it, the Shubra road is a really fine drive, broad, level, raised some 6 or 8 feet above the cultivated plain, closely planted on both sides with acacias and sycamore fig trees, and reaching straight away for 4 miles out of Cairo, counting from the railway terminus to the Summer Palace. The carriageway is about as wide as the road across Hyde Park which connects Bayswater with Kensington, and towards the Shubra end, it runs close beside the Nile. Many of the sycamores are of great size and quite patriarchal girth. Their branches meet overhead nearly all the way, weaving a delicious shade and making a cool tunnel of the long perspective. We did not stay long in the Khedive's gardens, for it was already getting late when we reached the gates, but we went far enough to see that they were tolerably well kept, not over-formal, and laid out with a view to masses of foliage, shady paths, and spaces of turf inlaid with flower beds, after the style of the famous Sarntheum and Moser gardens at Botzen in the Tyrol. Here are sant trees, Acacia nilotica, of unusual size, powdered all over with little feathery tufts of yellow blossom, orange and lemon trees in abundance, heaps of little green limes, bananas bearing heavy pendant bunches of ripe fruit, winding thickets of pomegranates, oleanders, and salvias, and great beds, and banks, and trellised walks of roses. Among these, however, I observed none of the rarer varieties. As for the poinsettia, it grows in Egypt to a height of 20 feet, and bears blossoms of such size and color as we in England can form no idea of. We saw large trees of it both here and at Alexandria that seemed as if bending beneath a mantle of crimson stars, some of which cannot have measured less than 22 inches in diameter. A large Italian fountain in a Rococo style is the great sight of the place. We caught a glimpse of it through the trees, and surprised the gardener who was showing us over by declining to inspect it more nearly. He could not understand why we preferred to give our time to the shrubs and flower beds. Driving back presently towards Cairo with a big handful of roses apiece, we saw the sun going down in an aureole of fleecy pink and golden clouds, the Nile flowing by like a stream of liquid light, and a little fleet of sailing boats going up to Bulak before a puff of north wind that had sprung up as the sun neared the horizon. That puff of north wind, those gliding sails, had a keen interest for us now, and touched us nearly, because, I have delayed this momentous revelation till the last moment, because we were to start tomorrow. And this is why I have been able, in the midst of so much that was new and bewildering, to remember quite circumstantially the dates, and all the events connected with these last 2 days. They were to be our last 2 days in Cairo, and tomorrow morning, Saturday the 13th of December, we were to go on board a certain dahabeah now lying off the iron bridge at Bulak, therein to begin that strange aquatic life to which we had been looking forward with so many hopes and fears, and towards which we had been steering through so many preliminary difficulties. But the difficulties were all over now, and everything was settled, though not in the way we had at first intended. For in place of a small boat, we had secured one of the largest on the river, and instead of going alone, we had decided to throw in our lot with that of 3 other travelers. One of these 3 was already known to the writer. The other 2, friends of the first, were on their way out from Europe, and were not expected in Cairo for another week. We knew nothing of them but their names. Meanwhile L. and the writer, assuming sole possession of the dahabeah, were about to start 10 days in advance, it being their intention to push on as far as Rhoda, the ultimate point then reached by the Nile Railway, and there to await the arrival of the rest of the party. Now Rhoda, more correctly Rhoda, is just 180 miles south of Cairo, and we calculated upon seeing the Saqqara pyramids, the Tura quarries, the tombs of Beni Hassan, and the famous grotto of the Colossus on the sledge, before our fellow travelers should be due. It depends on the wind, you know, said our dragoman, with a lugubrious smile. We knew that it depended on the wind, but what then? In Egypt, the wind is supposed always to blow from the north at this time of the year, and we had 10 good days at our disposal. The observation was clearly irrelevant. A rapid raid into some of the nearest shops, for things remembered at the last moment, a breathless gathering up of innumerable parcels, a few hurried farewells on the steps of the hotel, and away we rattle as fast as a pair of raw-boned greys can carry us. For this morning every moment is of value. We are already late, we expect visitors to luncheon on board at midday, and we are to weigh anchor at 2 p.m. Hence our anxiety to reach Bulak before the bridge is opened, that we may drive across to the western bank against which our dahabeah lies moored. Hence also our mortification when we arrive just in time to see the bridge swing apart and the first tall mast glide through. Presently, however, when those on the lookout have observed our signals of distress, a smart-looking sandal, or jolly boat, decked with gay rugs and cushions, manned by 5 smiling Arabs, and flying a bright little New Union Jack, comes swiftly threading her way in and out among the lumbering barges now crowding through the bridge. In a few more minutes, we are afloat. For this is our sandal, and these are 5 of our crew, and of the 3 dahabiyas moored over yonder in the shade of the palms, the biggest by far, and the trimmest, is our dear, memorable, Falai. Close behind the Falai lies the Bagstones, a neat little dahabiya in the occupation of 2 English ladies who chanced to cross with us in the Simla, from Brindisi, and of whom we have seen so much ever since that we regard them by this time as quite old friends in a strange land. I will call them the MBS. The other boat, lying off a few yards ahead, carries the tricolor, and is chartered by a party of French gentlemen. All 3 are to sail today. And now we are on board, and have shaken hands with the captain, and are as busy as bees, for there are cabins to put in order, flowers to arrange, and 100 little things to be seen to before the guests arrive. It is wonderful, however, what a few books and roses, an open piano, and a sketch or 2 will do. In a few minutes the comfortless hired look has vanished, and long enough before the first comers are announced, the Falai wears an aspect as cozy and homelike as if she had been occupied for a month. As for the luncheon, it certainly surprised the givers of the entertainment quite as much as it must have surprised their guests. Being, no doubt, a pre-arranged display of professional pride on the part of dragoman and cook, it was more like an excessive Christmas dinner than a modest midday meal. We sat through it unflinchingly, however, for about an hour and 3/4, when a startling discharge of firearms sent us all running upon deck, and created a wholesome diversion in our favor. It was the French boat signaling her departure, shaking out her big sail, and going off triumphantly. I fear that we of the Bagstones and Falai, being mere mortals and English women, could not help feeling just a little spiteful when we found the tricolor had started first, but then it was a consolation to know that the Frenchmen were going only to Aswan. Such is the esprit du Nil. The people in dahabiyas despise Cook's tourists. Those who are bound for the second cataract look down with lofty compassion upon those whose ambition extends only to the first, and travelers who engage their boat by the month hold their heads a trifle higher than those who contract for the trip. We, who were going as far as we liked and for as long as we liked, could afford to be magnanimous. So we forgave the Frenchmen, went down again to the saloon, and had coffee and music. It was nearly 3 o'clock when our Cairo visitors wished us bon voyage and goodbye. Then the MBS, who, with their nephew, had been of the party, went back to their own boat, and both captains prepared to sail at a given signal. For the MBS had entered into a solemn convention to start with us, moor with us, and keep with us, if practicable, all the way up the river. It is pleasant now to remember that this sociable compact, instead of falling through as such compacts are wont to do, was quite literally carried out as far as Abu Simbel, that is to say, during a period of 7 weeks hard going, and for a distance of upwards of 800 miles. At last all is ready. The awning that has all day roofed in the upper deck is taken down, the captain stands at the head of the steps, the steersman is at the helm, the dragoman has loaded his musket. Is the Bagstones ready? We wave a handkerchief of inquiry, the signal is answered, the mooring ropes are loosened, the sailors pull the boat off from the bank, bang go the guns, 6 from the Falai, and 6 from the Bagstones, and away we go, our huge sail filling as it takes the wind. Happy are the Nile travelers who start thus with a fair breeze on a brilliant afternoon. The good boat cleaves her way swiftly and steadily. Waterside palaces and gardens glide by, and are left behind. The domes and minarets of Cairo drop quickly out of sight. The mosque of the citadel, and the ruined fort that looks down upon it from the mountain ridge above, diminish in the distance. The pyramids stand up sharp and clear. We sit on the high supper deck, which is furnished with lounge chairs, tables, and foreign rugs, like a drawing room in the open air, and enjoy the prospect at our ease. The valley is wide here and the banks are flat, showing a steep verge of crumbling alluvial mud next the river. Long belts of palm groves, tracts of young corn only an inch or 2 above the surface, and clusters of mud huts relieved now and then by a little whitewashed cupola or a stumpy minaret, succeed each other on both sides of the river, while the horizon is bounded to right and left by long ranges of yellow limestone mountains, in the folds of which sleep inexpressibly tender shadows of pale violet and blue. Thus the miles glide away, and by we approach Tura, a large, new-looking mud village, and the first of any extent that we have yet seen. Some of the houses are whitewashed, a few have glass windows, and many seem to be unfinished. A space of white, stony, glaring plain separates the village from the quarried mountains beyond, the flanks of which show all gashed and hewn away. One great cliff seems to have been cut sheer off for a distance of perhaps half a mile. Where the cuttings are fresh, the limestone comes out dazzling white, and the long slopes of debris heaped against the foot of the cliffs glisten like snowdrifts in the sun. Yet the outer surface of the mountains is orange-tawny, like the pyramids. As for the piles of rough-hewn blocks that lie ranged along the bank ready for transport, they look like salt rather than stone. Here lies moored a whole fleet of cargo boats, laden and lading, and along the tramway that extends from the riverside to the quarries, we see long trains of mule carts coming and going. For all the new buildings in Cairo, the Khedive's palaces, the public offices, the smart modern villas, the glaring new streets, the theaters, and foot pavements, and cafes, all come from these mountains, just as the pyramids did, more than 6,000 years ago. There are hieroglyph tablets and sculptured grottos to be seen in the most ancient part of the quarries, if one were inclined to stop for them at this early stage of the journey, and Champollion tells of two magnificent outlines done in red ink upon the living rock by some master hand of pharaonic times, the cutting of which was never even begun. A substantial new barak and an esplanade planted with sycamore figs bring the straggling village to an end. And now, as the afternoon wanes, we draw near to a dense, wide-spreading forest of stately date palms on the western bank, knowing that beyond them, though unseen, lie the mounds of Memphis and all the wonders of Saqqara. Then the sun goes down behind the Libyan hills, and the palms stand out black and bronzed against a golden sky, and the pyramids, left far behind, look grey and ghostly in the distance. Presently, when it is quite dusk and the stars are out, we moor for the night at Bedrashain, which is the nearest point for visiting Saqqara. There is a railway station here, and also a considerable village, both lying back about half a mile from the river, and the distance from Cairo, which is reckoned at 15 miles by the line, is probably about 18 by water. Such was our first day on the Nile. And perhaps, before going farther on our way, I ought to describe the Falai, and introduce Rees Hassan and his crew. A dahabeeyah, at the first glance, is more like a civic or an Oxford University barge, than anything in the shape of a boat with which we in England are familiar. It is shallow and flat-bottomed, and is adapted for either sailing or rowing. It carries two masts, a big one near the prow, and a smaller one at the stern. The cabins are on deck, and occupy the after part of the vessel, and the roof of the cabins forms the raised deck, or open-air drawing room already mentioned. This upper deck is reached from the lower deck by two little flights of steps, and is the exclusive territory of the passengers. The lower deck is the territory of the crew. A dahabeeyah is, in fact, not very unlike the Noah's Ark of our childhood, with this difference: the habitable part, instead of occupying the middle of the vessel, is all at one end, top-heavy and many-windowed, while the foredeck is not more than 6 feet above the level of the water. The hold, however, is under the lower deck, and so counterbalances the weight at the other end. Not to multiply comparisons unnecessarily, I may say that a large dahabeeyah reminds one of old pictures of the Bucentaur, especially when the men are at their oars. The kitchen, which is a mere shed like a Dutch oven in shape, and contains only a charcoal stove and a row of stewpans, stands between the big mast and the prow, removed as far as possible from the passengers' cabins. In this position the cook is protected from a favorable wind by his shed, but in the case of a contrary wind he is screened by an awning. How, under even the most favorable circumstances, these men can serve up the elaborate dinners which are the pride of a Nile cook's heart, is sufficiently wonderful, but how they achieve the same results when windstorms and sandstorms are blowing, and every breath is laden with the fine grit of the desert, is little short of miraculous. Thus far, all dahabeeyahs are alike. The cabin arrangements differ, however, according to the size of the boat, and it must be remembered that in describing the Falai, I describe a dahabeeyah of the largest build, her total length from stem to stern being just 100 feet, and the width of her upper deck at the broadest part little short of 20. Our floor being on a somewhat lower level than the men's deck, we went down 3 steps to the entrance door, on each side of which was an external cupboard, one serving as a storeroom and the other as a pantry. This door led into a passage out of which opened 4 sleeping cabins, 2 on each side. These cabins measured about 8 feet in length by 4.5 in width, and contained a bed, a chair, a fixed washing stand, a looking-glass against the wall, a shelf, a row of hooks, and under each bed 2 large drawers for clothes. At the end of this little passage another door opened into the dining saloon, a spacious, cheerful room, some 23 or 24 feet long, situate in the widest part of the boat, and lighted by 4 windows on each side and a skylight. The paneled walls and ceiling were painted in white picked out with gold, a cushioned divan covered with a smart woolen reps ran along each side, and a gay Brussels carpet adorned the floor. The dining table stood in the center of the room, and there was ample space for a piano, 2 little bookcases, and several chairs. The window curtains and portieres were of the same reps as the divan, the prevailing colors being scarlet and orange. Add a couple of mirrors in gilt frames, a vase of flowers on the table, for we were rarely without flowers of some sort, even in Nubia, where our daily bouquet had to be made with a few bean blossoms and castor oil berries, plenty of books, the gentlemen's guns and sticks in one corner, and the hats of all the party hanging in the spaces between the windows, and it will be easy to realize the homely, habitable look of our general sitting room. Another door and passage opening from the upper end of the saloon led to 3 more sleeping rooms, 2 of which were single and 1 double, a bathroom, a tiny back staircase leading to the upper deck, and the stern cabin saloon. This last, following the form of the stern, was semicircular, lighted by 8 windows and surrounded by a divan. Under this, as under the saloon divans, there ran a row of deep drawers, which, being fairly divided, held our clothes, wine, and books. The entire length of the dahabeeyah being exactly 100 feet, I take the cabin part to have occupied about 56 or 57 feet, that is to say, about 6 or 7 feet over the exact half, and the lower deck to have measured the remaining 43 feet. But these dimensions, being given from memory, are approximate. For the crew there was no sleeping accommodation whatever, unless they chose to creep into the hold among the luggage and packing cases. But this they never did. They just rolled themselves up at night, heads and all, in rough brown blankets, and lay about the lower deck like dogs. The reis, or captain, the steersman, and 12 sailors, the dragoman, head cook, assistant cook, 2 waiters, and the boy who cooked for the crew, completed our equipment. Reis Hassan, short, stern-looking, authoritative, was a Cairo Arab. The dragoman, Elias Talami, was a Syrian of Beirut. The 2 waiters, Michael and Habib, and the head cook, a wizened old cordon bleu named Hassan Badawi, were also Syrians. The steersman and 5 of the sailors were from Thebes, 4 belonged to a place near Falai, 1 came from a village opposite Qam Ambo, 1 from Cairo, and 2 were Nubians from Aswan. They were of all shades, from yellowish bronze to a hue not far removed from black, and though, at the first mention of it, nothing more incongruous can well be imagined than a sailor in petticoats and a turban, yet these men in their loose blue gowns, bare feet, and white muslin turbans, looked not only picturesque, but dressed exactly as they should be. They were for the most part fine young men, slender but powerful, square in the shoulders, like the ancient Egyptian statues, with the same slight legs and long flat feet. More docile, active, good-tempered, friendly fellows never pulled an oar. Simple and trustful as children, frugal as anchorites, they worked cheerfully from sunrise to sunset, sometimes towing the dahabeeyah on a rope all day long, like barge horses, sometimes punting for hours, which is the hardest work of all, yet always singing at their task, always smiling when spoken to, and made as happy as princes with a handful of coarse Egyptian tobacco, or a bundle of fresh sugar canes bought for a few pence by the riverside. We soon came to know them all by name: Mehemet Ali, Salami, Khalife, Rizq Ali, Hassan, Musa, and so on, and as none of us ever went on shore without 1 or 2 of them to act as guards and attendants, and as the poor fellows were constantly getting bruised hands or feet, and coming to the upper deck to be doctored, a feeling of genuine friendliness was speedily established between us. The ordinary pay of a Nile sailor is £2 a month, with an additional allowance of about 3 and 6 a month for flour. Bread is their staple food, and they make it themselves at certain places along the river where there are large public ovens for the purpose. This bread, which is cut up in slices and dried in the sun, is as brown as gingerbread and as hard as biscuit. They eat it soaked in hot water, flavored with oil, pepper, and salt, and stirred in with boiled lentils till the whole becomes of the color, flavor, and consistence of thick pea soup. Except on grand occasions, such as Christmas Day or the anniversary of the flight of the Prophet, when the passengers treat them to a sheep, this mess of bread and lentils, with a little coffee twice a day, and now and then a handful of dates, constitutes their only food throughout the journey. The Nile season is the Nile sailors' harvest time. When the warm weather sets in and the travelers migrate with the swallows, these poor fellows disperse in all directions, some to seek a living as porters in Cairo, others to their homes in Middle and Upper Egypt, where, for about 4 pence a day, they take hire as laborers, or work at Shadif irrigation till the Nile again overspreads the land. The Shadif work is hard, and a man has to keep on for 9 hours out of every 24, but he prefers it, for the most part, to employment in the government sugar factories, where the wages average at about the same rate, but are paid in bread, which, being doled out by unscrupulous inferiors, is too often of light weight and bad quality. The sailors who succeed in getting a berth on board a cargo boat for the summer are the most fortunate. Our captain, pilot, and crew were all Mohammedans. The cook and his assistant were Syrian Mohammedans. The dragoman and waiters were Christians of the Syrian Latin Church. Only 1 out of the 15 natives could write or read, and that one was a sailor named Ijendi, who acted as a sort of second mate. He used sometimes to write letters for the others, holding a scrap of tumbled paper across the palm of his left hand, and scrawling rude Arabic characters with a reed pen of his own making. This Ijendi, though perhaps the least interesting of the crew, was a man of many accomplishments, an excellent comic actor, a bit of a shoemaker, and a first-rate barber. More than once, when we happened to be stationed far from any village, he shaved his messmates all round, and turned them out with heads as smooth as billiard balls. There are, of course, good and bad Mohammedans as there are good and bad churchmen of every denomination, and we had both sorts on board. Some of the men were very devout, never failing to perform their ablutions and say their prayers at sunrise and sunset. Others never dreamed of doing so. Some would not touch wine, had never tasted it in their lives, and would have suffered any extremity rather than break the law of their prophet. Others had a nice taste in clarets, and a delicate appreciation of the respective merits of rum or whiskey punch. It is, however, only fair to add that we never gave them these things except on special occasions, as on Christmas Day, or when they had been wading in the river, or in some other way undergoing extra fatigue in our service. Nor do I believe there was a man on board who would have spent a para of his scanty earnings on any drink stronger than coffee. Coffee and tobacco are, indeed, the only luxuries in which the Egyptian peasant indulges, and our poor fellows were never more grateful than when we distributed among them a few pounds of cheap native tobacco. This abominable mixture sells in the bazaars at 6 pence the pound, the plant from which it is gathered being raised from inferior seed in a soil chemically unsuitable, because wholly devoid of potash. Also it is systematically spoiled in the growing. Instead of being nipped off when green and dried in the shade, the leaves are allowed to wither on the stalk before they are gathered. The result is a kind of rank hay without strength or flavor, which is smoked by only the very poorest class, and carefully avoided by all who can afford to buy Turkish or Syrian tobacco. Twice a day, after their midday and evening meals, our sailors were wont to sit in a circle and solemnly smoke a certain big pipe of the kind known as a hubble-bubble. This hubble-bubble, which was of most primitive make and consisted of a coconut and 2 sugar canes, was common property, and, being filled by the captain, went round from hand to hand, from mouth to mouth, while it lasted. They smoked cigarettes at other times, and seldom went on shore without a tobacco pouch and a tiny book of cigarette papers. Fancy a bare-legged Arab making cigarettes? No Frenchman, however, could twist them up more deftly, or smoke them with a better grace. A Nile sailor's service expires with the season, so that he is generally a landsman for about half the year, but the captain's appointment is permanent. He is expected to live in Cairo, and is responsible for his dahabiya during the summer months, while it lies up at Bulak. Rees Hassan had a wife and a comfortable little home on the outskirts of Old Cairo, and was looked upon as a well-to-do personage among his fellows. He received £4 a month all the year round from the owner of the Falai, a magnificent broad-shouldered Arab of about 6'9", with a delightful smile, the manners of a gentleman, and the rapacity of a Shylock. Our men treated us to a concert that first night, as we lay moored under the bank near Bedrashane. Being told that it was customary to provide musical instruments, we had given them leave to buy a tar and darabuka before starting. The tar, or tambourine, was pretty enough, being made of rosewood inlaid with mother-of-pearl, but a more barbarous affair than the darabuka was surely never constructed. This primitive drum is about 1.5 feet in length, funnel-shaped, molded of sun-dried clay like the cullas, and covered over at the top with strained parchment. It is held under the left arm and played like a tom-tom with the fingers of the right hand, and it weighs about 4 pounds. We would willingly have added a double pipe or a coconut fiddle one to the strength of the band, but none of our men could play them. The tar and darabuka, however, answered the purpose well enough, and were perhaps better suited to their strange singing than more tuneful instruments. We had just finished dinner when they began. First came a prolonged wail that swelled, and sank, and swelled again, and at last died away. This was the principal singer leading off with the keynote. The next followed suit on the third of the key, and finally all united in one long, shrill descending cry, like a yawn, or a howl, or a combination of both. This, twice repeated, prelude their performance and worked them up, apparently, to the necessary pitch of musical enthusiasm. The primo tenore then led off in a quavering roulade, at the end of which he slid into a melancholy chant to which the rest sang chorus. At the close of each verse they yawned and howled again, while the singer, carried away by his emotions, broke out every now and then into a repetition of the same amazing and utterly indescribably vocal wriggle with which he had begun. Whenever he did this, the rest held their breath in respectful admiration, and uttered an approving "ah," which is here the customary expression of applause. We thought their music horrible that first night, I remember, though we ended, as I believe most travelers do, by liking it. We, however, paid them the compliment of going upon deck and listening to their performance. As a night scene, nothing could be more picturesque than this group of turbaned Arabs sitting in a circle, cross-legged, with a lantern in the midst. The singer quavered, the musicians thrummed, the rest softly clapped their hands to time, and waited their turn to chime in with the chorus. Meanwhile the lantern lit up their swarthy faces and their glittering teeth. The great mast towered up into the darkness. The river gleamed below. The stars shone overhead. We felt we were indeed strangers in a strange land. Having arrived at Bedrashane after dark, and there moored for the night, we were roused early next morning by the furious squabbling and chattering of some 50 or 60 men and boys who, with a score or two of little rough-coated, depressed-looking donkeys, were assembled on the high bank above. Seen thus against the sky, their tattered garments fluttering in the wind, their brown arms and legs in frantic movement, they looked like a troop of mad monkeys let loose. Every moment the uproar grew shriller. Every moment more men, more boys, more donkeys, appeared upon the scene. It was as if some new Cadmus had been sowing boys and donkeys broadcast, and they had all come up at once for our benefit. Then it appeared that Ptolemy, knowing how 8 donkeys would be wanted for our united forces, had sent up to the village for 25, intending, with perhaps more wisdom than justice, to select the best and dismiss the others. The result was overwhelming. Misled by the magnitude of the order and concluding that Cook's party had arrived, every man, boy, and donkey in Bedrashane and the neighboring village of Mitrahyna had turned out in hot haste and rushed down to the river, so that by the time breakfast was over there were steeds enough in readiness for all the English in Cairo. I pass over the tumult that ensued when our party at last mounted the 8 likeliest beasts and rode away, leaving the indignant multitude to disperse at leisure. And now our way lies over a dusty flat, across the railway line, past the long straggling village, and through the famous plantations known as the Palms of Memphis. There is a crowd of patient-looking fellaheen at the little whitewashed station, waiting for the train, and the usual rabble of clamorous water, bread, and fruit sellers. Bedrashane, though a collection of mere mud hovels, looks pretty, nestling in the midst of stately date palms. Square pigeon towers, embedded round the top with layers of wide-mouthed pots and stuck with rows of leafless acacia boughs like ragged banner poles, stand up at intervals among the huts. The pigeons go in and out of the pots, or sit preening their feathers on the branches. The dogs dash out and bark madly at us, as we go by. The little brown children pursue us with cries of bakshish. The potter, laying out rows of soft, gray, freshly molded clay bowls and cullas one to bake in the sun, stops open-mouthed, and stares as if he had never seen a European till this moment. His young wife snatches up her baby and pulls her veil more closely over her face, fearing the evil eye. The village being left behind, we ride on through one long palm grove after another, now skirting the borders of a large sheet of tranquil backwater, now catching a glimpse of the far-off pyramids of Gizeh, now passing between the huge irregular mounds of crumbled clay which marked the site of Memphis. Next beyond these we come out upon a high embanked road some 20 feet above the plain, which here spreads out like a wide lake and spends its last dark brown alluvial wave against the yellow rocks which define the edge of the desert. High on this barren plateau, seen for the first time in one unbroken panoramic line, there stands a solemn company of pyramids, those of Saqqara straight before us, those of Dashur to the left, those of Abusir to the right, and the great pyramids of Gizeh always in the remotest distance. It might be thought there would be some monotony in such a scene, and but little beauty. On the contrary, however, there is beauty of a most subtle and exquisite kind, transcendent beauty of color, and atmosphere, and sentiment, and no monotony either in the landscape or in the forms of the pyramids. One of these which we are now approaching is built in a succession of platforms gradually decreasing towards the top. Another down yonder at Dashur curves outward at the angles, half dome, half pyramid, like the roof of the Palais de Justice in Paris. No two are of precisely the same size, or built at precisely the same angle, and each cluster differs somehow in the grouping. Then again the coloring. Coloring not to be matched with any pigments yet invented. The Libyan rocks, like rusty gold, the paler hue of the driven sand slopes, the warm maize of the nearer pyramids which, seen from this distance, takes a tender tint of rose, like the red bloom on an apricot, the delicate tone of these objects against the sky, the infinite gradation of that sky, soft and pearly towards the horizon, blue and burning towards the zenith, the opalescent shadows, pale blue, and violet, and greenish-gray, that nestle in the hollows of the rock and the curves of the sand drifts, all this is beautiful in a way impossible to describe, and alas, impossible to copy. Nor does the lake-like plain with its palm groves and cornflats form too tame a foreground. It is exactly what is wanted to relieve that glowing distance. And now, as we follow the zigzag of the road, the new pyramids grow gradually larger, the sun mounts higher, the heat increases. We meet a train of camels, buffaloes, shabby-grown sheep, men, women, and children of all ages. The camels are laden with bedding, rugs, mats, and crates of poultry, and carry, besides, 2 women with babies and 1 very old man. The younger men drive the tired beasts. The rest follow behind. The dust rises after them in a cloud. It is evidently the migration of a family of 3, if not 4 generations. One cannot help being struck by the patriarchal simplicity of the incident. Just thus, with flocks and herds and all his clan, went Abraham into the land of Canaan close upon 4,000 years ago, and one at least of these Saqqara pyramids was even then the oldest building in the world. It is a touching and picturesque procession, much more picturesque than ours, and much more numerous, notwithstanding that our united forces, including donkey boys, porters, and miscellaneous hangers-on, number nearer 30 than 20 persons. For there are the M.B.S. and their nephew, and L, and the rider, and L.S. maid, and Ptolemy, all on donkeys, and then there are the owners of the donkeys, also on donkeys, and then every donkey has a boy, and every boy has a donkey, and every donkey boy's donkey has an inferior boy in attendance. Our style of dress, too, however convenient, is not exactly in harmony with the surrounding scenery, and one cannot but feel, as these draped and dusty pilgrims pass us on the road, that we cut a sorry figure with our hideous palm-leaf hats, green veils, and white umbrellas. But the most amazing and incongruous personage in our whole procession is unquestionably George. Now George is an English North Country groom whom the M.B.S. have brought out from the wilds of Lancashire, partly because he is a good shot and may be useful to Master Alfred after birds and crocodiles, and partly from a well-founded belief in his general abilities. And George, who is a fellow of infinite jest and infinite resource, takes to Eastern life as a duckling to the water. He picks up Arabic as if it were his mother tongue. He skins birds like a practiced taxidermist. He can even wash and iron on occasion. He is, in short, groom, footman, housemaid, laundrymaid, stroke-oar, gamekeeper, and general factotum all in one. And besides all this, he is gifted with a comic gravity of countenance that no surprises and no disasters can upset for a moment. To see this worthy anachronism cantering along in his groom's coat and gaiters, livery buttons, spotted neckcloth, tall hat, and all the rest of it, his long legs dangling within an inch of the ground on either side of the most diminutive of donkeys, his double-barreled fowling piece under his arm, and that imperturbable look in his face, one would have sworn that he and Egypt were friends of old, and that he had been brought up on pyramids from his earliest childhood. It is a long and shelterless ride from the palms to the desert, but we come to the end of it at last, mounting just such another sandslope as that which leads up from the Gizeh road to the foot of the Great Pyramid. The edge of the plateau here rises abruptly from the plain in one long range of low perpendicular cliffs pierced with dark mouths of rock-cut sepulchres, while the sandslope by which we are climbing pours down through a breach in the rock, as an alpine snowdrift flows through a mountain gap from the ice level above. And now, having dismounted through compassion for our unfortunate little donkeys, the first thing we observe is the curious mixture of debris underfoot. At Gizeh one treads only sand and pebbles, but here at Saqqara the whole plateau is thickly strewn with scraps of broken pottery, limestone, marble, and alabaster, flakes of green and blue glaze, bleached bones, shreds of yellow linen, and lumps of some odd-looking dark brown substance, like dried-up sponge. Presently some one picks up a little noseless head of one of the common blue-water funereal statuettes, and immediately we all fall to work, grubbing for treasure, a pure waste of precious time, for though the sand is full of debris, it has been sifted so often and so carefully by the Arabs that it no longer contains anything worth looking for. Meanwhile, one finds a fragment of iridescent glass, another, a morsel of shattered vase, a third, an opaque bead of some kind of yellow paste. And then, with a shock which the present writer, at all events, will not soon forget, we suddenly discover that these scattered bones are human, that those linen shreds are shreds of cerement cloths, that yonder odd-looking brown lumps are rent fragments of what once was living flesh. And now for the first time we realize that every inch of this ground on which we are standing, and all these hillocks and hollows and pits in the sand, are violated graves. Ce n'est que le premier pas qui coûte. We soon became quite hardened to such sights, and learned to rummage among dusty sepulchres with no more compunction than would have befitted a gang of professional body snatchers. These are experiences upon which one looks back afterwards with wonder, and something like remorse, but so infectious is the universal callousness, and so overmastering is the passion for relic hunting, that I do not doubt we should again do the same things under the same circumstances. Most Egyptian travelers, if questioned, would have to make a similar confession. Shocked at first, they denounce with horror the whole system of sepulchral excavation, legal as well as predatory. Acquiring, however, a taste for scarabs and funerary statuettes, they soon begin to buy with eagerness the spoils of the dead, finally they forget all their former scruples, and ask no better fortune than to discover and confiscate a tomb for themselves. Notwithstanding that I had first seen the pyramids of Gizeh, the size of the Saqqara group, especially of the pyramid in platforms, took me by surprise. They are all smaller than the pyramids of Khufu and Khafra, and would no doubt look sufficiently insignificant if seen with them in close juxtaposition, but taken by themselves they are quite vast enough for grandeur. As for the pyramid in platforms, which is the largest at Saqqara, and next largest to the pyramid of Khafra, its position is so fine, its architectural style so exceptional, its age so immense, that one altogether loses sight of these questions of relative magnitude. If Egyptologists are right in ascribing the royal title hieroglyphed on the inner door of this pyramid to Ouenefs, the fourth king of the first dynasty, then it is the most ancient building in the world. It had been standing from 500 to 700 years when King Khufu began his great pyramid at Gizeh. It was over 2,000 years old when Abraham was born. It is now about 6,800 years old according to Manetho and Mariette, or about 4,800 according to the computation of Bunsen. One's imagination recoils upon the brink of such a gulf of time. The door of this pyramid was carried off, with other precious spoils, by Lepsius, and is now in the museum at Berlin. The evidence that identifies the inscription is tolerably direct. According to Manetho, an Egyptian historian who wrote in Greek and lived in the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus, King Ouenefs built for himself a pyramid at a place called Kokholm. Now a tablet discovered in the Serapeum by Mariette gives the name of Kakem to the necropolis of Saqqara, and as the pyramid in stages is not only the largest on this platform, but is also the only one in which a royal cartouche has been found, the conclusion seems obvious. When a building has already stood 5,000 or 6,000 years in a climate where mosses and lichens, and all those natural signs of age to which we are accustomed in Europe are unknown, it is not to be supposed that a few centuries more or less can tell upon its outward appearance, yet to my thinking the pyramid of Ouenefs looks older than those of Gizeh. If this be only fancy, it gives one, at all events, the impression of belonging structurally to a ruder architectural period. The idea of a monument composed of diminishing platforms is in its nature more primitive than that of a smooth four-sided pyramid. We remarked that the masonry on one side, I think on the side facing eastwards, was in a much more perfect condition than on either of the others. Wilkinson describes the interior as a hollow dome supported here and there by wooden rafters, and states that the sepulchral chamber was lined with blue porcelain tiles. 2 We would have liked to go inside, but this is no longer possible, the entrance being blocked by a recent fall of masonry. Making up now for lost time, we rode on as far as the house built in 1850 for Mariette's accommodation during the excavation of the Serapeum, a labor which extended over a period of more than 4 years. The Serapeum, it need hardly be said, is the famous and long-lost sepulchral temple of the sacred bulls. These bulls, honored by the Egyptians as successive incarnations of Osiris, inhabited the temple of Apis at Memphis while they lived, and being mummied after death, were buried in catacombs prepared for them in the desert. In 1850, Mariette, traveling in the interests of the French government, discovered both the temple and the catacombs, being, according to his own narrative, indebted for the clue to a certain passage in Strabo, which describes the temple of Serapis as being situate in a district where the sand was so drifted by the wind that the approach to it was in danger of being overwhelmed, while the sphinxes on either side of the great avenue were already more or less buried, some having only their heads above the surface. If Strabo had not written this passage, says Mariette, it is probable that the Serapeum would still be lost under the sands of the necropolis of Saqqara. One day, however, in 1850, being attracted to Saqqara by my Egyptological studies, I perceived the head of a sphinx showing above the surface. It evidently occupied its original position. Close by lay a libation table on which was engraved a hieroglyphic inscription to Apis Osiris. Then that passage in Strabo came to my memory, and I knew that beneath my feet lay the avenue leading to the long and vainly sought Serapeum. Without saying a word to anyone, I got some workmen together and we began excavating. The beginning was difficult, but soon the lions, the peacocks, the Greek statues of the dramas, the inscribed tablets of the temple of Nectanebo III rose up from the sands. Thus was the Serapeum discovered. The house, a slight, one-story building on a space of rocky platform, looks down upon a sandy hollow which now presents much the same appearance that it must have presented when Mariette was first reminded of the fortunate passage in Strabo. 1 or 2 heads of sphinxes peep up here and there in a ghastly way above the sand, and mark the line of the great avenue. The upper half of a boy riding on a peacock, apparently of rude execution, is also visible. The rest is already as completely overwhelmed as if it had never been uncovered. One can scarcely believe that only 20 years ago, the whole place was entirely cleared at so vast an expenditure of time and labor. The work, as I have already mentioned, took 4 years to complete. This avenue alone was 600 feet in length and bordered by an army of sphinxes, 141 of which were found in situ. As the excavation neared the end of the avenue, the causeway, which followed a gradual descent between massive walls, lay 70 feet below the surface. The labor was immense, and the difficulties were innumerable. The ground had to be contested inch by inch. In certain places, says Mariette, the sand was fluid, so to speak, and baffled us like water continually driven back and seeking to regain its level. If, however, the toil was great, so also was the reward. A main avenue terminated by a semicircular platform, around which stood statues of famous Greek philosophers and poets, a second avenue at right angles to the first, the remains of the great temple of the Serapeum, 3 smaller temples, and 3 distinct groups of Apis catacombs, were brought to light. A descending passage opening from a chamber in the great temple led to the catacombs, vast labyrinths of vaults and passages hewn out of the solid rock on which the temples were built. These 3 groups of excavations represent 3 epochs of Egyptian history. The first and most ancient series consists of isolated vaults dating from the XVIIth to the XXIInd dynasty, that is to say, from about BC 1703 to BC 980. The second group, which dates from the reign of Sheshonkai, XXIInd dynasty, BC 980, to that of Taraka, the last king of the XXVTH dynasty, is more systematically planned, and consists of one long tunnel bordered on each side by a row of funereal chambers. The third belongs to the Greek period, beginning with Psammetichus I, XXVth dynasty, BC 665, and ending with the latest Ptolemies. Of these, the first are again choked with sand, the second are considered unsafe, and the third only is accessible to travelers. After a short but toilsome walk, and some delay outside a prison-like door at the bottom of a steep descent, we were admitted by the guardian, a gaunt old Arab with a lantern in his hand. It was not an inviting-looking place within. The outer daylight fell upon a rough step or two, beyond which all was dark. We went in. A hot, heavy atmosphere met us on the threshold, the door fell to with a dull clang, the echoes of which went wandering away as if into the central recesses of the earth. The Arab chattered and gesticulated. He was telling us that we were now in the great vestibule, and that it measured ever so many feet in this and that direction, but we could see nothing, neither the vaulted roof overhead, nor the walls on any side, nor even the ground beneath our feet. It was like the darkness of infinite space. A lighted candle was then given to each person, and the Arab led the way. He went dreadfully fast, and it seemed at every step as if one were on the brink of some frightful chasm. Gradually, however, our eyes became accustomed to the gloom, and we found that we had passed out of the vestibule into the first great corridor. All was vague, mysterious, shadowy. A dim perspective loomed out of the darkness. The lights twinkled and flitted, like wandering sparks of stars. The Arab held his lantern to the walls here and there, and showed us some votive tablets inscribed with records of pious visits paid by devout Egyptians to the sacred tombs. Of these they found 500 when the catacombs were first opened, but Mariette sent nearly all to the Louvre. A few steps farther, and we came to the tombs, a succession of great vaulted chambers hewn out at irregular distances along both sides of the central corridor, and sunk some 6 or 8 feet below the surface. In the middle of each chamber stood an enormous sarcophagus of polished granite. The Arab, flitting on ahead like a black ghost, paused a moment before each cavernous opening, flashed the light of his lantern on the sarcophagus, and sped away again, leaving us to follow as we could. So we went on, going every moment deeper into the solid rock, and farther from the open air and the sunshine. Thinking it would be cold underground, we had brought warm wraps in plenty, but the heat, on the contrary, was intense, and the atmosphere stifling. We had not calculated on the dryness of the place, nor had we remembered that ordinary mines and tunnels are cold because they are damp. But here for incalculable ages, for thousands of years probably before the Nile had even cut its path through the rocks of Silsilis, a cloudless African sun had been pouring its daily floods of light and heat upon the dewless desert overhead. The place might well be unendurable. It was like a great oven stored with the slowly accumulated heat of cycles so remote, and so many, that the earliest periods of Egyptian history seem, when compared with them, to belong to yesterday. Having gone on thus for a distance of nearly 200 yards, we came to a chamber containing the first hieroglyph sarcophagus we had yet seen, all the rest being polished, but plain. Here the Arab paused, and finding access provided by means of a flight of wooden steps, we peeped inside by the help of a ladder, and examined the hieroglyphs with which it is covered. Enormous as they look from above, one can form no idea of the bulk of these huge monolithic masses except from the level on which they stand. This sarcophagus, which dates from the reign of Amasis, of the XXVth dynasty, measured 14 feet in length by 11 in height, and consisted of a single block of highly wrought black granite. 4 persons might sit in it round a small card table, and play a rubber comfortably. From this point the corridor branches off for another 200 yards or so, leading always to more chambers and more sarcophagi, of which last there are altogether 24. 3 only are inscribed, none measure less than from 13 to 14 feet in length, and all are empty. The lids in every instance have been pushed back a little way, and some are fractured, but the spoilers have been unable wholly to remove them. According to Mariette, the place was pillaged by the early Christians, who, besides carrying off whatever they could find in the way of gold and jewels, seem to have destroyed the mummies of the bulls, and razed the great temple nearly to the ground. Fortunately, however, they either overlooked, or left as worthless, some hundreds of exquisite bronzes and the 500 votive tables before mentioned, which, as they record not only the name and rank of the visitor, but also, with few exceptions, the name and year of the reigning pharaoh, afford invaluable historical data, and are likely to do more than any previously discovered documents towards clearing up disputed points of Egyptian chronology. It is a curious fact that 1 out of the 3 inscribed sarcophagi should bear the oval of Cambyses, that Cambyses of whom it is related that, having desired the priests of Memphis to bring before him the god Apis, he drew his dagger in a transport of rage and contempt, and stabbed the animal in the thigh. According to Plutarch, he slew the beast and cast out its body to the dogs. According to Herodotus, Apis lay some time pining in the temple, but at last died of his wound, and the priests buried him secretly. But according to one of these previous Serapeum tablets the wounded bull did not die till the 4th year of the reign of Darius. So wonderfully does modern discovery correct and illustrate tradition. And now comes the sequel to this ancient story in the shape of an anecdote related by M. About, who tells how Mariette, being recalled suddenly to Paris some months after the opening of the Serapeum, found himself without the means of carrying away all his newly excavated antiquities, and so buried 14 cases in the desert, there to await his return. One of these cases contained an Apis mummy which had escaped discovery by the early Christians, and this mummy was that of the identical Apis stabbed by Cambyses. That the creature had actually survived his wound was proved by the condition of one of the thigh bones, which showed unmistakable signs of both injury and healing. Nor does the story end here. Mariette being gone, and having taken with him all that was most portable among his treasures, there came to Memphis one whom M. About indicates as a young and august stranger, traveling in Egypt for his pleasure. The Arabs, tempted perhaps by a princely bakshish, revealed the secret of the hidden cases, whereupon the Archduke swept off the whole 14, dispatched them to Alexandria, and immediately shipped them for Trieste. 5 Quanto coupable, says M. About, who professes to have had the story direct from Mariette. Il a fini si tragiquement dans un autre hémisphère que, tout bien pis, j'ai once à publier son nom. But through so transparent a disguise it is not difficult to identify the unfortunate hero of this curious anecdote. The sarcophagus in which the Apis was found remains in the vaults of the Serapeum, but we did not see it. Having come more than 200 yards already, and being by this time well nigh suffocated, we did not care to put 200 yards more between ourselves and the light of day. So we turned back at the half distance, having, however, first burned a pan of magnesium powder, which flared up wildly for a few seconds, lit the huge gallery and all its cavernous recesses and the wondering faces of the Arabs, and then went out with a plunge, leaving the darkness denser than before. From hence, across a farther space of sand, we went in all the blaze of noon to the tomb of one T, a priest and commoner of the 5th dynasty, who married with a lady named Neferhotepes, the granddaughter of a pharaoh, and here built himself a magnificent tomb in the desert. Of the facade of this tomb, which must originally have looked like a little temple, only 2 large pillars remain. Next comes a square courtyard surrounded by a roofless colonnade, from one corner of which a covered passage leads to 2 chambers. In the center of the courtyard yawns an open pit some 25 feet in depth, with a shattered sarcophagus just visible in the gloom of the vault below. All here is limestone, walls, pillars, pavements, even the excavated debris with which the pit had been filled in when the vault was closed forever. The quality of this limestone is close and fine like marble, and so white that, although the walls and columns of the courtyard are covered with sculptures of most exquisite execution and of the greatest interest, the reflected light is so intolerable that we find it impossible to examine them with the interest they deserve. In the passage, however, where there is shade, and in the large chamber, where it is so dark that we can see only by the help of lighted candles, we find a succession of bas-reliefs so numerous and so closely packed that it would take half a day to see them properly. Ranged in horizontal parallel lines about 1.5 feet in depth, these extraordinary pictures, row above row, cover every inch of wall space from floor to ceiling. The relief is singularly low. I should doubt if it anywhere exceeds 1/4 of an inch. The surface, which is covered with a thin film of very fine cement, has a quality and polish like ivory. The figures measure an average height of about 12 inches, and all are colored. Here, as in an open book, we have the biography of T. His whole life, his pleasures, his business, his domestic relations, are brought before us with just that faithful simplicity which makes the charm of Montaigne and Pepys. A child might read the pictured chronicles which illuminate these walls, and take as keen a pleasure in them as the wisest of archaeologists. T was a wealthy man, and his wealth was of the agricultural sort. He owned flocks and herds and vassals in plenty. He kept many kinds of birds and beasts, geese, ducks, pigeons, cranes, oxen, goats, asses, antelopes, and gazelles. He was fond of fishing and fowling, and used sometimes to go after crocodiles and hippopotamuses, which came down as low as Memphis in his time. He was a kind husband too, and a good father, and loved to share his pleasures with his family. Here we see him sitting in state with his wife and children, while professional singers and dancers perform before them. Yonder they walk out together and look on while the farm servants are at work, and watch the coming in of the boats that bring home the produce of Ti's more distant lands. Here the geese are being driven home, the cows are crossing a ford, the oxen are plowing, the sower is scattering his seed, the reaper plies his sickle, the oxen tread the grain, the corn is stored in the granary. There are evidently no independent tradesfolk in these early days of the world. T has his own artificers on his own estate, and all his goods and chattels are homemade. Here the carpenters are fashioning new furniture for the house, the shipwrights are busy on new boats, the potters mold pots, the metalworkers smelt ingots of red gold. It is plain to see that T lived like a king within his own boundaries. He makes an imposing figure, too, in all these scenes, and, being represented about 8 times as large as his servants, sits and stands a giant among pygmies. His wife, we must not forget that she was of the blood royal, is as big as himself, and the children are depicted about half the size of their parents. Curiously enough, Egyptian art never outgrew this early naivete. The great man remained a big man to the last days of the Ptolemies, and the fellow was always a dwarf. 6. Apart from these and 1 or 2 other mannerisms, nothing can be more natural than the drawing, or more spirited than the action, of all these men and animals. The most difficult and transitory movements are expressed with masterly certitude. The donkey kicks up his heels and brays, the crocodile plunges, the wild duck rises on the wing, and the fleeting action is caught in each instance with a truthfulness that no landseer could distance. The forms, which have none of the conventional stiffness of later Egyptian work, are modeled roundly and boldly, yet finished with exquisite precision and delicacy. The coloring, however, is purely decorative, and being laid on in single tints, with no attempt at gradation or shading, conceals rather than enhances the beauty of the sculptures. These, indeed, are best seen where the color is entirely rubbed off. The tints are yet quite brilliant in parts of the larger chamber, but in the passage and courtyard, which have been excavated only a few years and are with difficulty kept clear from day to day, there is not a vestige of color left. This is the work of the sand, that patient laborer whose office it is not only to preserve but to destroy. The sand secretes and preserves the work of the sculptor, but it effaces the work of the painter. In sheltered places where it accumulates passively like a snowdrift, it brings away only the surface detail, leaving the undercolors rubbed and dim. But nothing, as I had occasion constantly to remark in the course of the journey, removes color so effectually as sand which is exposed to the shifting action of the wind. This tomb, as we have seen, consists of a portico, a courtyard, 2 chambers, and a sepulchral vault, but it also contains a secret passage of the kind known as a serdab. These serdabs, which are constructed in the thickness of the walls and have no entrances, seem to be peculiar to the tombs of the ancient empire, i.e. the period of the Pyramid Kings, and they contain statues of the deceased of all sizes, in wood, limestone, and granite. 20 statues of T were here found immured in the serdab of his tomb, all broken save one, a spirited figure in limestone, standing about 7 feet high, and now in the museum at Bulaq. This statue represents a fine young man in a white tunic, and is evidently a portrait. The features are regular, the expression is good-natured, the whole tournure of the head is more Greek than Egyptian. The flesh is painted of a yellowish brick tint, and the figure stands in the usual hieratic attitude, with the left leg advanced, the hands clenched, and the arms straightened close to the sides. One seems to know T so well after seeing the wonderful pictures in his tomb, that this charming statue interests one like the portrait of a familiar friend. 7. How pleasant it was, after being suffocated in the Serapeum and broiled in the tomb of T, to return to Mariette's deserted house, and eat our luncheon on the cool stone terrace that looks northward over the desert. Some wooden tables and benches are hospitably left here for the accommodation of travelers, and fresh water in ice-cold cullas is provided by the old Arab guardian. The yards and offices at the back are full of broken statues and fragments of inscriptions in red and black granite. 2 sphinxes from the famous avenue adorn the terrace, and look down upon their half-buried companions in the sand hollow below. The yellow desert, barren and undulating, with a line of purple peaks on the horizon, reaches away into the far distance. To the right, under a jutting ridge of rocky plateau not 200 yards from the house, yawns an open-mouthed black-looking cavern shored up with heavy beams and approached by a slope of debris. This is the forced entrance to the earlier vaults of the Serapeum, in one of which was found a mummy described by Mariette as that of an Apis, but pronounced by Brucksch to be the body of Prince Khamenei, governor of Memphis and the favorite son of Ramesses the Great. This remarkable mummy, which looked as much like a bull as a man, was found covered with jewels and gold chains and precious amulets engraved with the name of Khamenei, and had on its face a golden mask, all which treasures are now to be seen in the Louvre. If it was the mummy of an Apis, then the jewels with which it was adorned were probably the offering of the prince at that time ruling in Memphis. If, on the contrary, it was the mummy of a man, then, in order to be buried in a place of peculiar sanctity, he probably usurped one of the vaults prepared for the god. The question is a curious one, and remains unsolved to this day, but it could no doubt be settled at a glance by Professor Owen. 8. Far more startling, however, than the discovery of either Apis or jewels, was a sight beheld by Mariette on first entering that long-closed sepulchral chamber. The mine being sprung and the opening cleared, he went in alone, and there, on the thin layer of sand that covered the floor, he found the footprints of the workmen who, 3,700 years before, had laid this shapeless mummy in its tomb and closed the doors upon it, as they believed, forever. And now, for this afternoon is already waning fast, the donkeys are brought round, and we are told that it is time to move on. We have the site of Memphis and the famous prostrate colossus yet to see, and the long road lies all before us. So back we ride across the desolate sands, and with a last, long, wistful glance at the pyramid in platforms, go down the territory of the dead into the land of the living. There is a wonderful fascination about this pyramid. One is never weary of looking at it, of repeating to oneself that it is indeed the oldest building on the face of the whole earth. The king who erected it came to the throne, according to Manetho, about 80 years after the death of Mena, the founder of the Egyptian monarchy. All we have of him is his pyramid, all we know of him is his name. And these belong, as it were, to the infancy of the human race. In dealing with Egyptian dates, one is apt to think lightly of periods that count only by centuries, but it is a habit of mind which leads to error, and it should be combated. The present writer found it useful to be constantly comparing relative chronological eras, as, for instance, in realizing the immense antiquity of the Saqqara pyramid, it is some help to remember that from the time when it was built by King Ouenephes to the time when King Khufu erected the Great Pyramid of Gizeh, there probably lies a space of years equivalent to that which, in the history of England, extends from the date of the conquest to the accession of George II. 10 and yet Khufu himself, the Cheops of the Greek historians, is but a shadowy figure hovering upon the threshold of Egyptian history. And now the desert is left behind, and we are nearing the palms that lead to Memphis. We have of course been dipping into Herodotus, every one takes Herodotus up the Nile, and our heads are full of the ancient glories of this famous city. We know that Mena turned the course of the river in order to build it on the very spot, and that all the most illustrious pharaohs adorned it with temples, palaces, pylons, and precious sculptures. We had read of the great temple of Ptah that Ramesses the Great enriched with colossi of himself, and of the sanctuary where Apis lived in state, taking his exercise in a pillared courtyard where every column was a statue, and of the artificial lake, and the sacred groves, and the obelisks, and all the wonders of a city which even in its later days was one of the most populous in Egypt. Thinking over these things by the way, we agree that it is well to have left Memphis till the last. We shall appreciate it the better for having first seen that other city on the edge of the desert to which, for nearly 6,000 years, all Memphis was quietly migrating, generation after generation. We know now how poor folk labored, and how great gentlemen amused themselves, in those early days when there were hundreds of country gentlemen like T, with townhouses at Memphis and villas by the Nile. From the Serapeum, too, buried and ruined as it is, one cannot but come away with a profound impression of the splendor and power of a religion which could command for its myth such faith, such homage, and such public works. And now we are once more in the midst of the palmwoods, threading our way among the same mounds that we passed in the morning. Presently those in front strike away from the beaten road across a grassy flat to the right, and the next moment we are all gathered round the brink of a muddy pool in the midst of which lies a shapeless block of blackened and corroded limestone. This, it seems, is the famous prostrate colossus of Ramesses the Great, which belongs to the British nation, but which the British government is too economical to remove. 11 So here it lies, face downward, drowned once a year by the Nile, visible only when the pools left by the inundation have evaporated, and all the muddy hollows are dried up. It is one of two which stood at the entrance to the great temple of Ptah, and by those who have gone down into the hollow and seen it from below in the dry season, it is reported of as a noble and very beautiful specimen of one of the best periods of Egyptian art. Where, however, is the companion colossus? Where is the temple itself? Where are the pylons, the obelisks, the avenues of sphinxes? Where, in short, is Memphis? The dragoman shrugs his shoulders and points to the barren mounds among the palms. They look like gigantic dust heaps, and stand from 30 to 40 feet above the plain. Nothing grows upon them, save here and there a tuft of stunted palm, and their substance seems to consist chiefly of crumbled brick, broken potsherds, and fragments of limestone. Some few traces of brick foundations and an occasional block or two of shaped stone are to be seen in places low down against the foot of one or two of the mounds, but one looks in vain for any sign which might indicate the outline of a boundary wall or the position of a great public building. And is this all? No, not quite all. There are some mud huts yonder, in among the trees, and in front of one of these we find a number of sculptured fragments, battered sphinxes, torsos without legs, sitting figures without heads, in green, black, and red granite. Ranged in an irregular semicircle on the sward, they seem to sit in forlorn conclave, half solemn, half ludicrous, with the goats browsing round, and the little Arab children hiding behind them. Near this, in another pool, lies another red granite colossus, not the fellow to that which we saw first, but a smaller one, also face downwards. And this is all that remains of Memphis, eldest of cities, a few huge rubbish heaps, a dozen or so of broken statues, and a name. One looks round, and tries in vain to realize the lost splendors of the place. Where is the Memphis that King Mena came from Thynis to found, the Memphis of Ouenephes, and Khufu, and Khafra, and all the early kings who built their pyramid tombs in the adjacent desert? Where is the Memphis of Herodotus, of Strabo, of Abd el-Latif? Where are those stately ruins which, even in the Middle Ages, extended over a space estimated at half a day's journey in every direction? One can hardly believe that a great city ever flourished on this spot, or understand how it should have been effaced so utterly. Yet here it stood, here where the grass is green, and the palms are growing, and the Arabs build their hovels on the verge of the inundation. The great colossus marks the site of the main entrance to the Temple of Ptah. It lies where it fell, and no man has moved it. That tranquil sheet of palm-fringed backwater, beyond which we see the village of Mitrahyna and catch a distant glimpse of the pyramids of Gizeh, occupies the basin of a vast artificial lake excavated by Mena. The very name of Memphis survives in the dialect of the Fella, who calls the place of the mounds Tel Month 12, just as Saqqara fossilizes the name of Saqqari, one of the special denominations of the Memphite Osiris. No capital in the world dates so far back as this, or kept its place in history so long. Founded 4,000 years before our era, it beheld the rise and fall of 31 dynasties, it survived the rule of the Persian, the Greek, and the Roman. It was, even in its decadence, second only to Alexandria in population and extent, and it continued to be inhabited up to the time of the Arab invasion. It then became the quarry from which Phostat was built, and as the new city rose on the eastern bank, the people of Memphis quickly abandoned their ancient capital to desolation and decay. Still a vast field of ruins remained. Abd el-Latif, writing at the commencement of the 13th century, speaks with enthusiasm of the colossal statues and lions, the enormous pedestals, the archways formed of only 3 stones, the bas-reliefs and other wonders that were yet to be seen upon the spot. Marco Polo, if his wandering tastes had led him to the Nile, might have found some of the palaces and temples of Memphis still standing, and Sandys, who in AD 1610 went at least as far south of Cairo as Kafr el-Ayat, says that, up the river for 20 miles space there was nothing but ruins. Since then, however, the very ruins have vanished, the palms have had time to grow, and modern Cairo has doubtless absorbed all the building material that remained from the Middle Ages. Memphis is a place to read about, and think about, and remember, but it is a disappointing thing to see. To miss it, however, would be to miss the first link in the whole chain of monumental history which unites the Egypt of antiquity with the world of today. Those melancholy mounds and that heron-haunted lake must be seen, if only that they may take their due place in the picture gallery of one's memory. It had been a long day's work, but it came to an end at last, and as we trotted our donkeys back towards the river, a gorgeous sunset was crimsoning the palms and pigeon towers of Bedrashane. Everything seemed now to be at rest. A buffalo, contemplatively chewing the cud, lay close against the path and looked at us without moving. The children and pigeons were gone to bed. The pots had baked in the sun and been taken in long since. A tiny column of smoke went up here and there from amid the clustered huts, but there was scarcely a moving creature to be seen. Presently we passed a tall, beautiful fellow woman standing grandly by the wayside, with her veil thrown back and falling in long folds to her feet. She smiled, put out her hand, and murmured, "Bakshish." Her fingers were covered with rings, and her arms with silver bracelets. She begged because to beg is honorable, and customary, and a matter of inveterate habit, but she evidently neither expected nor needed the bakshish she condescended to ask for. A few moments more and the sunset has faded, the village is left behind, the last half-mile of plain is trotted over. And now, hungry, thirsty, dusty, worn out with new knowledge, new impressions, new ideas, we are once more at home and at rest.